Chapter 41-43. However, Ji Tianqing still couldn't confirm which army would be ambushed in the east or west. He also didn't know the imperial tutor's exact plan or when they would attack. However, this wasn't important to Duguzhan and clan leader Wanyan. After receiving Ji Tianqing's message, they only grasped one key piece of information. That was, if they were really ambushed, they shouldn't think about fighting to the death. Instead, they should conserve their strength. This made Duguzhan and the Wanyan clan head calm down and let out a sigh of relief. Previously, they were still worried about whether they should fight to the death if they were really ambushed. If they didn't fight with all their might, they would disgrace the rebel alliance's reputation and go against the Kenshin's orders. They would most likely be punished by the Kenshin. However, if they were to fight to the death, there would be no tacit understanding between the 10 forces. It would be very difficult for them to unleash their full strength. They would definitely be at a disadvantage and suffer heavy casualties. Fortunately, Ji Tianqing's message completely resolved their worries. Duguzhan and clan leader Wanyan hurriedly went to inform their subordinate forces and pass on the Kenshin's instructions. When the various forces learned of the Kenshin's attitude, their worries disappeared. They became much more relaxed. On the other side, Ji Tianqing's uneasiness grew stronger and stronger. The premonition in his mind grew stronger and stronger. He knew that what he predicted would happen very soon. It was very likely that it would happen tonight. Therefore, he simply stopped his secluded cultivation and closed his eyes to rest in the cockpit of the god-slaying battleship. At the same time, he patiently waited for clan leader Wanyan and Duguzhan's reply. The Eastern army led by Duguzhan maintained a vigilant and alert posture. They also slowed down their speed. In order to avoid being ambushed by the imperial tutor soldiers, Duguzhan and the other god kings of the various forces were all on high alert. They used their divine senses and secret techniques to scout their surroundings. If there was any danger, they would be able to detect it in advance and react accordingly. The Western army led by clan leader Wanyan was similarly cautious and slowed down their speed. Everyone was on high alert, casting all kinds of divine spells to scout the surroundings in advance to see if there was an ambush. However, the Western expedition army sent out by the imperial tutor had long locked onto the direction and trajectory of the Western expedition army. They had also made arrangements and ambushes in advance. Even though the 4,000 soldiers of the West Road were all on high alert. However, they still did not realize that danger and crisis were rapidly approaching. Very quickly, 4 hours passed. It was dawn, and the long night had finally come to an end. A glimmer of dawn had already appeared on the horizon. At this moment, the 5 divine warships that the Western army was riding on were flying over a mountain range at lightning speed. There weren't any kingdoms or cities in the surrounding hundreds of thousands of miles. This was a primeval forest with few people. Towering ancient trees could be seen everywhere. After receiving Ji Tianqing's reminder, clan leader Wanyan, who was in charge of the army on the Western Road, had been paying close attention to the outside to prevent any accidents from happening. At the same time, he had also discussed with several of his trusted subordinates and elders how the imperial tutor would attack them if he sent out a powerful army. His trusted subordinates and elders all agreed that the army sent by the imperial tutor would most likely set up an ambush in a domain chief's manor not far away, just like the god slayer. If the Western army advanced triumphantly and recklessly rushed into the domain chief's manor, they would be surrounded by enemies from both sides and would be fiercely attacked by the imperial tutor's army. Given the coordination and combat strength of the Western army, once they were surrounded and ambushed in a secret realm, they would most likely be wiped out. However, after listening to the discussion of his trusted subordinates and elders, clan leader Wanyan frowned and pondered for a long time. In the end, he shook his head and rejected the idea. Previously, the imperial tutor used this method to send out the god slayer to set up an ambush in advance to deal with the Western army. Although the god slayer's ambush was successful, the appearance of Kenshin led to the complete annihilation of the God Slayer. I think that the Imperial Tutor has suffered a loss once, and he will never make the same mistake again. Upon hearing clan leader Wanyan's words, his trusted subordinates and elders all looked puzzled. Clan leader, do you mean that the army sent by the Imperial Tutor won't ambush us in the next domain chief's manor? This is the safest way to do it. If the Imperial Tutor doesn't carry out the same plan, what will he do? The answer is obvious. If the army sent by the Imperial Tutor doesn't ambush us in a secret realm, then they will definitely intercept us halfway. That's right. If we are suddenly attacked by the army under the command of the Imperial Tutor while we are hurrying along, we will definitely be caught off guard and suffer heavy casualties. But the problem is that we have been flying and hurrying along. How many calculations and deductions did the Imperial Tutor make in order to send his army to the place where we are bound to pass by in advance? Everyone guessed what the Imperial Tutor would do and realized that danger would soon befall them. There was no need to wait for 4 or 5 days. Perhaps tonight would be the night to see the outcome. Just as everyone was discussing animatedly, an ear-piercing shriek suddenly sounded from the divine warship. That was the warning array set up by clan leader Wanyan's warship. Once the array was activated, the ear-piercing shriek would spread, which meant that something had happened. Clan leader Wanyan and the other god kings stopped discussing and released their divine senses to check the situation outside the divine warship. They wouldn't know if they didn't look, but they were shocked when they saw it. Clan leader Wanyan and the others clearly remembered that they were flying over a desolate mountain range. There wasn't even a shadow in the surroundings. But now, with the 6 warships of the Western Divine Warship as the center, thousands of Sir God experts appeared out of thin air. The originally peaceful land and forest lit up with 5-colored divine lights that shot up to the sky and formed a canopy with a radius of 20,000 miles in the sky. When the 5-colored canopy was formed, the area within a radius of 20,000 miles was sealed off. If the 5 warships of the Western Divine Warship did not want to crash into the 5-colored canopy, they could only try to stop. Swish, swish, swish. In the blink of an eye, the 5 warships stopped steadily in the sky and formed a defensive formation around each other. Clan leader Wanyan and the leaders of the 4 forces also communicated with each other using their divine senses. Damn it! Sure enough, the Imperial Preceptor sent an army of nearly 8,000 people to attack us here. Although their method is very old-fashioned, it is very effective. The biggest problem is that how can the Imperial Tutor deduce our whereabouts and location? Now is not the time to think about this. The most important thing now is for everyone to be alert and prepare to face the enemy. After the discussion ended, more than 3,000 soldiers rushed out of the 5 warship. All of them were wearing armor and holding swords. Their fighting spirit was high. Under the command of clan leader Wanyan and the other family leaders, the 3,000 experts also joined forces and formed a thick defensive line. The night wind whistled, and the atmosphere was dead silent. The Western Divine Warship did not take the initiative to attack. The 7,000 soldiers just surrounded the Western Divine Warship. Naturally, the Western Divine Warship would not act rashly. They were still searching for the leaders of the Western Divine Warship. Chapter 41-44. The 3,000 soldiers of the Western Army were on high alert, their expressions solemn. The few hundred soldiers left behind on the divine ships also operated the 5 divine ships. They activated all the arrays on the ships and accumulated a vast amount of power. Although they looked orderly and majestic, the Western Army was composed of 5 forces. But in reality, the Western Army was made up of 5 factions. Even if they had been working together for a few months, there was no tacit understanding or cooperation between them. Seriously speaking, this was the first time the Western Army had faced a war. From the moment they formed the army and began to carry out Ji Tianqing's orders to persuade them to surrender, everything had been smooth sailing. They had not encountered any resistance. Tonight, in order to protect themselves, they were finally going to fight to the death. Moreover, they were being ambushed and surrounded by 8,000 soldiers of the Western Army. Not only were their opponents more elite and more tacit, but they also had twice the number of soldiers. The battle had not yet begun, but the 4,000 soldiers of the Western Army were already filled with pessimism and worry. Their hearts were uneasy. Just as the atmosphere was somber and the battlefield was silent on the Western Army's side, 2 old men in luxurious robes walked out from the crowd, escorted by 10 divine generals. From the attitude of the crowd, one could see that the 2 old men were the leaders of the Western Army. One of the old men was thin and wore a purple brocade robe. His long gray hair was tied up in a simple bun. He looked very simple and low-key. However, his strength was at the 9th level of the God-King realm. His cultivation was very profound. Seeing the appearance of the purple-robed old man, the Western Army's God-King powerhouses were shocked and incredulous. Several patriarchs could not help but cry out in alarm. Internal Affairs Grand Commander? Isn't he the Grand Commander in charge of the Azura Divine Palace's internal affairs? Doesn't he never leave the Azura Divine Palace? Damn it! The Imperial Tutor is determined to destroy us. He even sent the Internal Affairs Grand Commander to fight. This is enough to prove that the Imperial Tutor has no one he can use. Indeed, the purple-robed old man was the Internal Affairs Grand Commander of the Azura Divine Palace. He was in charge of the Azura Divine Palace's internal affairs. For 1,000 years, the Internal Affairs Grand Commander had been in the Azura Divine Palace, handling all kinds of affairs and maintaining the stability and dignity of the Azura Divine Palace. Ordinary people didn't have the qualifications to enter the Azura Divine Palace, so they naturally didn't recognize the Internal Affairs Great Commander. However, the several ancient family clans of the Western Army had all entered the Azura Divine Palace before. Naturally, they had seen the Internal Affairs Great Commander before. No one had expected that the Imperial Tutor would send this expert to lead an army to carry out an ambush mission. After a moment of surprise, everyone's gaze fell on the other old man. It was a white-haired old man wearing a luxurious blue robe. His entire body was inlaid with jade and beads, and his hair was tied up with a gorgeous divine crown. His entire body exuded a noble and dignified aura. Seeing this person, the expressions of the clan leaders of the Western Army became somewhat complicated, and they all frowned. It's actually him? I don't think many of the younger generation know him, right? He is the Grand Elder of the Kanglin clan? That's right. He is Kanglin Undying, a legendary expert who was born in the ancient times, more than 20,000 years ago. I've long heard that the low-key Kanglin clan has secretly pledged allegiance to the Azura God Emperor. Today, this rumor has been verified. The experts dispatched by the Imperial Tutor before were all his subordinates, the direct subordinates of the Azura God Emperor. Now, not only is he sending the Internal Affairs Great Commander to fight, but he's also sending Kanglin Undying to lead the army. From this, it can be seen that the Imperial Tutor is truly lacking in powerhouses. Is this considered good news amidst all the bad news? Don't think so much. Let's first think about how we can break out of this encirclement. The clan leaders secretly communicated with each other, their hearts brimming with worry and anxiety. At this time, the Internal Affairs Great Commander and Kanglin Undying led 10 divine generals into the field. They looked at the powerhouses of the 5 factions and spoke. You should all know this one and God King Kanglin. As for why this one has led 8,000 elite soldiers here, you should all be well aware. This one won't waste any more words. Now I will give you 2 choices. Surrender and submit to the Imperial Tutor. Or be surrounded and killed by this one's 8,000 soldiers, dying without a complete corpse. The Internal Affairs Great Commander's expression was very cold, and his tone was not very fierce or domineering. However, the aura and attitude he displayed was extremely domineering and unquestionable. The soldiers of the Western Army were somewhat restless at these words, many of them whispering to each other. The Internal Affairs Great Commander wants us to surrender? Isn't he going to start a war and kill us all? He's actually giving us a way out? Truly inconceivable. Could it be that the Imperial Tutor is lacking manpower and urgently needs to replenish his forces? Don't think about that. Even if the Internal Affairs Great Commander gives us a way out, we can't surrender. That's right. With the oath binding us, even if we wanted to surrender, who would dare? I'm just afraid that we'll be struck to pieces by heavenly lightning as soon as we say we're going to surrender. Sigh, the Kenshin's oath of surrender is truly too ruthless. It doesn't give us a way out at all. Shut up. Don't forget that we're already part of the Rebel Alliance. We're soldiers under the Kenshin. Don't you dare criticize the Alliance leader. That's right. The heavens are watching us all the time. Be careful, trouble comes from careless talk. The soldiers of the 5 forces were discussing, and the clan leaders were also communicating telepathically with complicated expressions on their faces. Clan leader Wanyan frowned and took a step forward. He cupped his fists and bowed to the Internal Affairs Great Commander and Kanglin Immortal. His expression was solemn as he said, "Thank you for your kind intentions, seniors. Even if you and I are enemies, you can still give us a way out. Unfortunately, the Great Commander might not know that when we joined the Rebel Alliance, we made an oath to be witnessed and bound by the heavens. Therefore, we appreciate the Great Commander's kind intentions. I'm very sorry, but we can't surrender." The Internal Affairs Great Commander frowned and glanced sideways at Kanglin Immortal, who was beside him, with an inquiring look. He had only heard that the Kenshin's oath of surrender was very harsh and terrifying. However, he did not know the exact content of the oath. As for clan leader Wanyan's words, he could not tell whether they were true or false, so he asked Kanglin Immortal. Kanglin Immortal nodded at him, proving that clan leader Wanyan was telling the truth. Only then did the Internal Affairs Great Commander believe him. He looked coldly at clan leader Wanyan and said, "In that case, you can only blame yourselves for being stupid and choosing to believe the Kenshin. Since you've made your choice, you should pay the price. I will personally send you on your way." After that, the Internal Affairs Great Commander did not waste any more words with the Western Army. He waved his hand and gave the order to attack. Kill them all. Following the Internal Affairs Great Commander's cold shout, the 8,000 Western Punitive Expedition soldiers who were ready to attack immediately launched a siege. The hundreds of soldiers who were in charge of controlling the Heaven and Earth Great Formation used all their strength to activate the Divine Formation. They released an invisible force to suppress the Western Army. More than 7,000 armored and sword-wielding soldiers also charged from all directions, releasing overwhelming divine light and shadows. Chapter 41-45. If it was Nangong Buhua leading the Southern Army, they would definitely fight back. If it was Ji Tianxing leading the Northern Army, they would fight until they killed all 8,000 of the Western Punitive Expedition Army. However, it was the Western Army that was being attacked. They were 5 forces that were not very loyal. Therefore, it was absolutely impossible to expect them to fight a bloody battle. Before the battle started, clan leader Wanyan had already thought of a plan. He knew that the 5 forces did not have a tacit understanding, so he transmitted his idea to the other clan leaders. Don't fight with them. We need to break out of the encirclement and escape. We should be able to catch them off guard. This is our only chance. I hope that everyone will cooperate. Otherwise, we will all die here. Later, the other party would definitely take the initiative to launch a siege. On the surface, we will block the first wave of attacks with all our strength. Secretly, we will send out 50 of our trusted subordinates with a large number of superior king-level divine artifacts to attack the southwest. The 50 subordinates will detonate the divine artifacts at all costs and blow up the seal array. Then, we will break out of the encirclement and charge out of the array. This was clan leader Wanyan's idea and suggestion. Although it was not brilliant, it was a quick-witted plan in a crisis. If used properly, it should be effective. Although the 5 ancient clans weren't very powerful and didn't have a supreme-grade king-level divine artifact, they were still very powerful. However, as an ancient clan that had existed for tens of thousands of years, they had a very deep foundation and a large number of superior king-level divine artifacts. Although superior king-level divine artifacts were very precious, no one would be willing to use them as a bomb. However, now that it was a matter of life and death, no one would feel bad about using them in order to survive. Thus, when the 8,000 Western Punitive Expedition Army besieged them, the patriarchs and elders of the 5 forces shouted loudly and led their subordinates to join forces and cast spells to resist. Dazzling divine light shone in the sky as battle cries shook the heavens. At first glance, the Western army appeared to be very hot-blooded and determined to fight to the death. However, everyone knew that they were only doing their best to block the first wave of attacks from the Western Punitive Expedition Army and minimize casualties. Everyone's hope of survival was placed on the 50 God Kings. Whoosh whoosh whoosh, more than 3,000 soldiers were fighting hot-bloodedly, and the 5 divine warships were also firing at full power. However, there were 50 God Kings among the crowd who were traveling in the opposite direction. Each clan sent out 10 God Kings, making a total of 50 people. They were currently charging towards the southwest without regard for anything else. The 5 clan heads and the sect master each collected more than a dozen king-grade high-grade god artifacts and handed them to the 50 God Kings. They rushed out of the crowd without any regard for their own safety. Even if they were injured by the divine spells that filled the sky, they still tried to get close to the edge of the ceiling formation. Boom boom boom! Bang 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 bang! The divine arts unleashed by the 8,000 soldiers of the Western Punitive Expedition Army clashed with the divine arts unleashed by the 3,000 soldiers of the Western Punitive Expedition Army, causing a deafening explosion. At this moment, the area within a radius of 20,000 miles was filled with endless fragments of divine light. Violent shock waves and air currents reverberated within the ceiling formation. In the first round of battle, the Western Punitive Expedition Army naturally had the advantage. More than 3,000 soldiers of the Western Army only managed to block 80% of the attack. Hundreds of soldiers were injured, and nearly 100 died on the spot. However, this result was still within the Wanyan clan leader's expectations. He could accept such casualties. Fortunately, they were able to block most of the attacks and protect the 50 God Kings who were responsible for the mission. They successfully made it to the southwest. When the 50 God Kings reached the edge of the ceiling formation, they took out all kinds of king-grade high-grade god artifacts and quickly cast spells to detonate them. Although there were nearly 1,000 soldiers of the Western Punitive Expedition Army at the edge of the ceiling formation, they immediately focused their firepower on the 50 God Kings. However, they were caught off guard and their reactions were not fast enough. They still lost the initiative. Even though they cast divine arts in time, they were still one step too slow. In the next moment, dozens of king-grade high-grade god artifacts exploded at the same time, releasing dazzling divine light that was as dazzling as the sun. Boom! Boom boom boom! A deafening explosion reverberated between heaven and earth, deafening even the apathetic. The violent shockwaves swept across a radius of 20,000 miles. Not only did it injure nearly 1,000 soldiers of the Western Punitive Expedition Army, but it also sent the 50 God Kings flying. Dozens of king-grade high-grade god artifacts exploded at the same time. It was no less powerful than the all-out attack of 3 peaked God Kings. The result was obvious. The ceiling formation that the Western Punitive Expedition Army had set up in advance could not withstand such a violent explosion. A huge crater with a radius of 3,000 feet was blasted open. The crater was surrounded by cracks and craters for more than 2,000 miles. The entire ceiling formation began to shake violently, letting out cracking noises, seeming to be on the verge of collapse. The commander of internal affairs and Kanglan Immortal did not expect such an outcome. The thousands of soldiers of the Western Punitive Expedition Army were also stunned. They did not expect the Western Punitive Expedition Army to be so cunning. They had planned to escape before the battle had even begun. Under normal circumstances, they would have fought for a few rounds. If they could not win, they would have broken through the encirclement and escaped. How could they be so shameless? They pretended to fight, but in fact they had already planned to escape. They had no integrity. How shameful! While the Western Punitive Expedition Army was in a daze and angry, the 3,000 soldiers of the Western Punitive Expedition Army turned around and rushed southwest as fast as they could. Who said that the 5 forces of the Western Punitive Expedition Army did not have a tacit understanding? Look at how they are running for their lives. Look at how fast they are running. Whoosh, whoosh, whoosh. The first to break through the hole in the ceiling formation were naturally the 50 Divine Kings. They were all badly injured. Their clothes were tattered, their bodies were covered in blood, and their bodies were riddled with wounds. A small portion of their injuries were caused by the Western Punitive Expedition Army. Most of them were caused by the explosion of the divine artifact. Whoosh, whoosh, whoosh. Soon after, the 5 god warships also passed through the hole at the speed of light and escaped from the ceiling array. Logically speaking, the divine warships should have brought up the rear. But everyone was running for their lives. They did not care about the order. They just wanted to see who could run faster. Fortunately, when the hole in the ceiling formation was blown open, more than half of the Western Punitive Expedition Army that was closest to it were killed. The remaining 300 or so were heavily injured and had lost their ability to fight. Thus, no one could stop the Western Punitive Expedition Army from escaping. Whoosh, whoosh, whoosh. Finally, the 3,000 soldiers of the Western Punitive Expedition Army reached the hole and rushed out of the ceiling formation without a care for their own safety. The Western Punitive Expedition Army in other directions finally reacted. They immediately rushed to the rescue and cast spells to stop them. Divine art attacks covered the sky and the earth. They shone with 5-colored divine light. Like a flood, they poured down on the hole. Rumble! Half of the 3,000 soldiers of the Western Punitive Expedition Army had escaped the ceiling formation. The rest were intercepted and could only cast spells to resist. They were held back and slowed down. Soon, they were surrounded by even more Western Punitive Expedition Army. Chapter 41-46. The Western Army that had rushed out of the ceiling array boarded the divine warship. They were temporarily safe. Everyone heaved a sigh of relief. However, before they escaped the pursuit of the Western Army, they did not dare to say that they were completely safe. They did not dare to let down their guard. The 5 divine warships deliberately slowed down and flew southwest. They could not wait outside the array for the other half of the soldiers to escape. They could only fly southwest and wait for the remaining soldiers to catch up. Whether or not the soldiers could escape the ceiling formation and survive was up to the will of the heavens. This method of cutting one's wrist to protect more people was also agreed upon by the 5 families. Soon 10 breaths passed. The 5 divine warships had flown 100,000 miles away from the ceiling array. More than 800 soldiers, covered in blood and heavily wounded, caught up with the divine warships of the various clans. As for the remaining 1,000 soldiers, they were all trapped near the ceiling formation, unable to escape. Seeing this, clan leader Wanyan decisively gave an order. Give up on the remaining people. Don't wait any longer. Let's move forward at full speed and get rid of them as soon as possible. Following his orders, the 5 divine battleships immediately began to speed up. They exploded with their fastest speed and fled towards the southwest. At the same time, there were still more than 800 soldiers outside the hole in the ceiling array. They were surrounded by thousands of soldiers from the Western Army. When the Western Army was escaping, they were at the back of the line. After being intercepted by the Western Army, they could no longer escape. They all thought that the divine warships and armies were still outside the sealing array, waiting for them to break out. Therefore, everyone tried their best to break out at all costs. In their opinion, as long as they could break out of the sealing array, they would be able to survive and escape. Unfortunately, the Western Army outnumbered them by several times. Even the commander of internal affairs and Kanglan Immortal took action personally. They used their supreme abilities to intercept the Western Army near the hole. As a result, the 800 or so soldiers of the Western Army were quickly surrounded and killed, turning into ashes. Even when they died, they did not know that the Western Army had already abandoned them and fled. 20 breaths later, the battle near the hole finally ended. The earth-shattering sound and the divine light that filled the sky gradually dissipated. Although the Western Punitive Army had achieved victory, they had killed more than 1,500 soldiers of the Western Punitive Army. However, there wasn't a trace of happiness on the faces of the great commander of internal affairs and Kanglan Immortal. Instead, their faces were dark and filled with anger. When the battle ended, they rushed out of the hole in the formation without hesitation, leading thousands of soldiers in pursuit towards the southwest. The mission given to us by the Imperial Tutor is to annihilate the Western Army and weaken the power of the Rebel Alliance to intimidate the boundless Heaven continent. But now we have only killed 1,500 people, and the main force of the Western Army has escaped. How do we explain this to the Imperial Tutor? 8,000 elite soldiers set up an ambush here in advance and successfully ambushed the weak Western Army. Not only did they fail to destroy the enemy, their main force even managed to escape. If the Imperial Tutor finds out about this, he will definitely accuse us of incompetence and incompetence. While chasing after the Western Army, the Internal Affairs Commander and Song Lan Undying both had such thoughts in their mind. The thousands of soldiers of the Western Punitive Expedition also understood this principle. Therefore, they couldn't be happy and could only fly with all their might. However, the death of the last 800 soldiers of the Western Army won the precious 20 breaths of time for the main force. When the Internal Affairs Commander and Song Lan Undying led the Western Punitive Expedition and began the pursuit, the Western Army had already escaped 400,000 miles away. Furthermore, the leaders of the 5 forces spared no expense in expending resources to maintain the divine warship at top speed. No matter how fast the Western Punitive Expedition was, they couldn't close the distance between the two sides. Even though the two sides chased in the sky for an hour, the Western Punitive Expedition still couldn't see the shadow of the Western Army. The distance between the two sides was maintained at around 300,000 miles. Most importantly, the Western Army didn't fly in a straight line under the command of clan leader Wan Yen. Every few 100,000 miles, the divine warships would slightly adjust their direction and change their route. Such a simple method could effectively slow down the speed of the Western Punitive Expedition. After all, the most powerful people in the Western Punitive Expedition were the Internal Affairs Commander and Song Lan Undying. Their divine senses could only detect a distance of 90,000 miles. They couldn't detect the traces of the Western Army and couldn't predict their escape route. They could only determine their opponent's route based on the remnant waves of divine power left behind by the 5 divine warships. Every time the Western Army changed direction, the Internal Affairs Commander and Song Lan Undying had to spend a few breaths of time to cast spells to detect the remnant waves of divine power left behind. This slowed down the Western Punitive Expedition and made it impossible for them to catch up to the Western Army. The Internal Affairs Commander and Song Lan Undying were furious and despised the Western Army's cunning, but there was nothing they could do. Unknowingly, 2 hours passed. The intense pursuit was still ongoing. The two sides had already flown over 20 million miles. Both sides had consumed a huge amount of resources, but the distance between them was still around 350,000 miles. Clearly, if this situation continued, the Western punitive expedition would never be able to catch up to the Western army. Unless the Western army ran out of resources or the divine warships broke down. But there was little hope for such a thing. Even if it happened, it would take 10 days to half a month. By then, the Western army would have fled back to the core of the Rebel Alliance's territory, and the other armies would have arrived to reinforce them. What was even more terrifying was that the Kenshin would arrive in less than 10 days to half a month. Thus, the Internal Affairs Commander and Song Lan Undying began to hesitate. The two of them stood in the cockpit of the divine warship and looked at the sky in front of them, discussing with gloomy expressions. The Western army was ambushed and suffered heavy losses. They will definitely send a message to the Kenshin. Now that the Kenshin knows about this, they will most likely be on their way to reinforce them. With the distance between us and the Kenshin, we will need to travel for half a month to reach them. But the Kenshin cannot be predicted with common sense. They will arrive in 3 days at the latest. This means that we only have 3 days at most. If we can't catch up to the Western army in 3 days, we should give up. Otherwise, if we encounter the Kenshin, the situation will be reversed. Your guess is correct, but that is based on the situation where the Kenshin has just received the news. What if the Kenshin has the ability to predict the future and predict that the Western army will be ambushed? 3 days? I think it will take at most 2 days. The Kenshin is indeed not a normal person. They can always create miracles and do unbelievable things. Actually, even if we chase them for 2 days, there is not much point. How about this? Let's set the time limit to 1 day. Chapter 41-47. The Internal Affairs Commander and Kanglin Immortal were both leaders of the West conquering army. However, there was still a gap between their statuses. The Internal Affairs Commander was the commander, while Kanglin Immortal, as the deputy commander, did not have much say. Since the Internal Affairs Commander decided to only chase for 1 day out of caution, Kanglin Immortal could only agree. The rest of the day was extremely torturous for everyone. Not only were the fleeing Western army tense up, but they could not relax. Even the Western Punitive Expedition Army, who were chasing after them, were equally tense. They were constantly in a state of combat. Apart from those who were seriously injured, they didn't have much fighting power left. They were still able to catch their breaths and were allowed to circulate their energy to recuperate. As for the others, even if they were slightly injured, they could only bear with it. However, despite both sides working so hard and risking their lives, the outcome did not change. 1 day finally passed. The distance between the two armies was still around 300,000 miles. Both parties had brought along an abundance of cultivation resources. It was impossible for them to run out of resources in a short period of time, which would cause the divine battleship to be unable to sustain itself. The Western army did not let down their guard and was not stupid enough to make another mistake. The West conquering army chased for an entire day but could not find an opportunity, so they could only give up. Under the orders of the Internal Affairs Commander, the few god ships stopped chasing and started to return. The soldiers naturally agreed and supported this decision. No one was stupid enough to oppose it. After all, the failure to destroy the Rebel Alliance's Western army was the fault of the two commanders. The Imperial Tutor would only blame them. However, if they continued to chase, they would be in the most danger. It was good to give up so that they could rest and recover. The West conquering army had given up. However, the army on the west, which was fleeing at top speed, did not know about this matter. After all, the two sides were 300,000 miles apart. No one's divine sense or divine ability could reach such a distance. The Western army could only use another method to check if the other side continued to chase. Every 2 hours, the Wanyan clan leader would take out 5 talismans and shoot them into the sky and earth. The 5 talismans would turn into invisible waves of light that merged into the clouds and earth, illuminating the surrounding tens of thousands of miles. The images of the 5 talismans would appear in a special mirror divine artifact in the hands of the Wanyan clan leader. This special artifact had the effect of remote monitoring and spying on images. It was often used to investigate information and some bad things. But at this moment, it was indeed the best choice to use this divine artifact to check if the Western Punitive Expedition Army had continued their pursuit. Swish, swish. Time was up again. Wanyan clan leader took out another 5 talismans and threw them out of the divine warship into the sky and the earth. The divine talisman burned and turned into streaks of golden light, merging into the sky and earth, disappearing without a trace. Then, the 5 battleships of the Western Army quickly left, disappearing into the horizon. Inside the battleship, the Wanyan clan leader took out an ancient bronze mirror. He cast a spell to activate this divine artifact and began to look at the images in the mirror. After a few breaths of time, the Western Army had flown 300,000 miles away. Based on his previous experience, the Western Punitive Expedition Army's battleships would soon appear on the screen and quickly pass by. However, the Wanyan clan leader waited quietly for a while, but he did not see any battleships of the Western Expedition Army. This result made him feel pleasantly surprised and relaxed, but at the same time, he was also very puzzled. The Internal Affairs Commander and Kanglin Immortal actually gave up on chasing us? That's not possible, right? They have been chasing us for an entire day. Why would they give up now? The Wanyan clan leader was naturally happy to see the Western Punitive Expedition Army stop chasing. He heaved a sigh of relief and could finally relax and recuperate. However, he did not dare to let his guard down. He was afraid that he would fall into the trap of the Imperial Tutor and the Internal Affairs Commander. Therefore, he did not inform everyone of this result and allowed the fleet to continue moving forward at full speed. At the same time, he began to ponder and analyze what the Western Punitive Expedition Army was up to. Did they lose us? Did they go in the wrong direction? That's not possible. With the strength of the Internal Affairs Commander and Kanglin Immortal, even if they went in the wrong direction, they would be able to immediately detect the problem. Now that 100 breaths of time have passed and they still haven't appeared, they definitely did not go in the wrong direction. Did they predict our path and want to use a shortcut to intercept us in advance? The Wanyan clan leader thought about it carefully and felt that it was not possible. Even he himself did not know the path and goal. It would be strange if the Internal Affairs Commander and Kanglin Immortal could guess it. The Wanyan clan leader thought about it but could not guess what the other party was up to. From the looks of it, the other party should have retreated and given up the chase. However, to be safe, the Wanyan clan leader waited for 15 minutes and released 5 divine talismans, scattering them between heaven and earth. Whoosh, whoosh, whoosh. The divine talismans turned into 5 rays of golden light and disappeared into the sky and earth. Then, the Wanyan clan leader held the ancient bronze mirror and watched it attentively, afraid that he would miss a single detail. 5 breaths of time passed and there was no movement in the mirror. 10 breaths of time passed and there was still nothing in the mirror. After 100 breaths of time, the Western Punitive Expedition Army had flown another 1,000,000 miles, but there was still no reaction from the ancient bronze mirror. This time, the Wanyan clan leader was finally sure that the other party had given up the chase. He did not hesitate and hurriedly informed everyone of this news. A moment later, cheers rang out from the 5 divine warships. Many people sighed in relief. The tense nerves of more than 2,000 soldiers finally relaxed at this moment. The 5 warships that were flying at high speed slowed down at the same time and returned to their normal speed. Everyone knew that the Western Punitive Expedition Army had given up the chase. However, they did not dare to stay in the same place and could only continue flying forward. Following the orders of the various clan leaders, the disciples under their command went to recuperate and rest. Only a portion of the uninjured were left to be on standby. After settling down the disciples, the clan leaders used their divine senses to ask the Wanyan clan leader about the next step of the plan. Clan leader Wanyan, what should we do next? Such a big thing has happened. Aren't you going to report to the Alliance leader first? Lord Alliance Master truly has the foresight. If we knew that the other party was so sinister and vicious, we would have listened to the Alliance leader's warning and taken a detour. Sigh. The Kenshin is indeed the Kenshin. I am completely convinced. Although I don't know how the Kenshin predicted that we would be in danger. However, I feel that we must obey the Kenshin's orders and decisions in the future. The Wanyan clan leader sneered in his heart when he heard the clan leader's lamentations. However, he did not show it. He transmitted his voice to everyone. A few hours ago, I sent a message to the Alliance Master and reported the specific situation. At that time, the Alliance leader did not give any instructions. He told us not to lower our guard and to contact him only when we are truly out of danger. Chapter 41-48. The Western Army was now completely out of danger. Under everyone's expectations, the Wanyan clan leader sent a message to Ji Tianqing to ask about their next course of action. After a short 100 breaths, Ji Tianqing sent a message back. The Wanyan clan leader eagerly took the jade slip and read the information inside. Ji Tianqing's dignified voice immediately sounded in his mind. Next, you can choose a place to rest for a few days. Then, you can head to the next area and continue with your mission. The soldiers under the Internal Affairs Commander and Kanglin Immortal didn't suffer any casualties. They won the ambush this time, but they didn't manage to annihilate the Western Army. They definitely won't give up. However, with the Imperial Tutor's style of doing things and the Internal Affairs Commander's cautious personality, they won't try to kill you in the near future. After you continue to conquer the other areas, I think the Internal Affairs Commander will try to test your strength. What he's most afraid of is that I'm secretly guarding the Western Army and waiting to annihilate them. If he can confirm that I'm not in the Western Army, he'll attack again. So, what you need to do now is to tell the other clan leaders to be extra careful. I'm leading the Western Army and attacking cities. I don't have time to support you. This news must be kept a secret. Only the clan leaders and their trusted subordinates know about it. This was the longest conversation between the Wanyan clan leader and Ji Tianqing after he joined the Rebel Alliance. The reason why it was so long was because Ji Tianqing told the Wanyan clan leader his plan in detail. The Wanyan clan leader wasn't stupid. He understood Ji Tianqing's meaning and guessed Ji Tianqing's plan. Suddenly, his emotions were stirred up, and his blood was boiling. He thought to himself, the Sword God is indeed unwilling to suffer losses. Our Western Army has suffered heavy losses, so he must annihilate the 8,000 soldiers under the command of the great commander of internal affairs. That's great. Soon, I'll be able to witness Kenshin's peerless glory. Excitement aside, Kenshin's mission still had to be carried out. Therefore, clan leader Wanyan quickly informed the other clan leaders and conveyed Kenshin's decree. 4 hours later, the 5 divine warships stopped quietly in a remote mountain range. They hid in the mountains to recuperate and heal their wounds. After the various patriarchs had settled down their disciples, they gathered together to discuss the plan. Everyone looked at the Wanyan clan leader and asked, Clan leader Wanyan, what other instructions does Lord Kenshin have? Kenshin-sama told us to rest for a few days. What about after that? Continue with the mission? The Wanyan clan leader nodded calmly and said, although we were ambushed and lost more than 1,000 soldiers, it was a heavy loss. However, our main force is still here. After resting and recuperating, we naturally have to continue with the mission. Everyone, don't worry. Given the nature of the Imperial Tutor and the Great Commander of Internal Affairs, they will definitely be very cautious and will not act against us. Hearing this, the other clan leaders frowned. Their expressions were somewhat complicated. One of the clan leaders smiled bitterly and said, in the short term, The great commander of internal affairs and the 8,000 elite soldiers will of course not act against us. However, they are unharmed and will definitely not give up. They will definitely annihilate us. Once we continue with the mission and conquer the various regions, they will ambush us again. At that time, who will be able to save us? Another clan leader added, Clan leader Wanyan, does Kenshin not plan to come and help us after knowing about this? The other clan leaders' eyes lit up. They all asked, the great commander of internal affairs has 8,000 elite soldiers. Other than Kenshin who can help us, the others are useless. We have suffered such heavy losses. If word gets out, it will damage the alliance's reputation. Is Kenshin going to swallow this humiliation? Through this ambush, the clan leaders had witnessed Ji Tianqing's strength. They all hoped that Ji Tianqing would come and help them. However, clan leader Wanyan glanced at them and said expressionlessly, the rebel alliance has 4 armies. Our leader will personally lead the northern army, which has the smallest number of people. If every army is ambushed and needs our leader to come and save them, how will he be able to save them all? Don't think too much about it. I have already asked our leader. He won't have time to come and save us. Everyone, please be extra careful. If we are ambushed again using the same strategy, it won't be a problem of strength anymore. It will be a problem of brains. After saying this, clan leader Wanyan planned to turn around and leave. The other clan leaders were stunned. Their faces were filled with pity and grievance. In their opinion, Kenshin did not trust them enough and did not care about their lives. This was really disappointing. At this moment, clan leader Wanyan, who had just turned around, stopped in his tracks. He warned everyone in a serious tone, "Oh right, regarding the fact that our leader won't be coming, I hope that everyone can keep it a secret. At most, only your confidants are allowed to know about it. Do not spread it out. Otherwise, it will endanger all of our lives and affect our leader's plan." After giving this warning, clan leader Wanyan finally left for real. The other clan leaders watched him leave. When his figure disappeared from the peak of the mountain, they began to discuss it telepathically. Damn it! Are we, who joined the rebel alliance later, so disliked by the Kenshin? When the southern army was ambushed, the Kenshin rushed over immediately to help. What about us? The Kenshin is obviously biased. Don't talk about it. The treatment of those who joined the alliance earlier is different from us. Our position in the leader's heart is also different. This is something that everyone knows. Don't think too much about it. If you want to blame someone, blame ourselves. We have been observing for a few months and did not seize the opportunity. The other clan leaders were indignant, but they knew that they had only themselves to blame. There was nothing to blame them for. They were just thinking that they had to be careful from now on. Just like what clan leader Wanyan said, if they were ambushed by the internal affairs commander with the same scheme twice, it would be too embarrassing. In the blink of an eye, 5 days had passed. The 2,000 men of the Western Army were almost done recuperating in the mountains. They set off on their journey again. They continued to carry out their mission and rushed to the Qiulun region to subdue Qiulun. At the same time, the news of the Western Army being ambushed and suffering heavy casualties began to spread throughout the boundless heaven continent. Of course, in order to keep it a secret, the Western Punitive Expedition did not take the initiative to publicize or leak the news. The channels and channels through which the news spread were unknown for the time being. However, what was certain was that the news did not spread widely. Only a few top forces and experts knew about it. As a result, those factions and god-kings focused their attention on the Great Army of the West and Great Army of the North. Everyone was speculating that this was the first time the Rebel Alliance had suffered a setback since its establishment. Would the Kenshin rush over to help the Western Army in a fit of anger and annihilate the 8,000 soldiers under the Internal Affairs Commander? Chapter 41-49. The factions and god-kings who knew the news were all paying attention to the Western and Northern armies. After a few days, the news about the two armies appeared. The Western Army arrived at Chiluan region and successfully subdued the region lord, saving the citizens of the region. Now, the rebel alliance had one more region under their control. After the Western Army completed their mission, they continued on to the next region. At the same time, under the leadership of the Sword God, the Northern Army was as busy as ever, attacking and plundering cities without stopping. Even though the Northern Army had the least number of people among the four armies. However, the Northern Army led by Kenshin was the strongest army in everyone's eyes. The Western and Northern Army that received the attention of various factions carried out their missions as usual, as if nothing had happened. Those factions and god kings secretly sighed at Kenshin's strong determination and sympathized with the Western Army. Everyone knew that the Western and Eastern Army had joined the rebel alliance later and did not have much of a place in Kenshin's heart. Therefore, the Western Army could only accept such a huge loss. Hoping that Kenshin would avenge them? That was impossible. The commander of internal affairs and Kanglin Immortal also came to the same conclusion. Ever since they gave up chasing the Western Army, they retreated to their temporary camp and rested for 3 days. During this time, the commander of internal affairs reported the situation to the imperial tutor and asked for instructions on what to do next. The imperial tutor's reply was very similar to the commander of internal affairs' thoughts. Although they won the ambush, it was not a complete victory. With 8,000 elite soldiers, they had to wipe out the Western Army before they could announce the news to the world. Since there were not many casualties, they could rest for a while and look for another opportunity. The key was to see how Kenshin would react when he heard the news. The commander of internal affairs had the same idea. After the army rested, he began to use the imperial tutor's intelligence network to gather information on the Kenshin and the Western Army's movements. In less than 2 days, he found out that the Western Army had subdued Chiluan region and was heading to the next region. The Kenshin, on the other hand, was still with the Northern Army and had yet to show their faces. After learning about the movements of the two armies and proving that the Kenshin was still in the north and did not reinforce the west, the internal affairs commander felt much more at ease. The reason why he had rested and observed for so long was because he was worried that Kenshin would go and reinforce the Western Army. If he rashly led 8,000 soldiers to besiege the army on the west and was slaughtered by the Kenshin, then his entire army would be wiped out. Although this sounded very exaggerated. However, Kenshin's glorious past was enough to prove his heaven-defying strength. The great commander of internal affairs heaved a sigh of relief in his heart. Then, he led the 8,000 elite soldiers and rushed to the Chioluan region without stopping. He wanted to catch up with the Western Army and then try to intercept and kill them. Inextinguishable Azure agreed with this. Moreover, he also ridiculed and disdained the Western Army's misfortune. Those fence-sitters wagging their tails and begging for mercy waited for a few months before they made up their minds to join the Kenshin. They even thought that they could gain the trust and respect of the Kenshin. Who knew that the Kenshin did not even care about their lives? What a joke! The Internal Affairs Commander also agreed with Inextinguishable Azure's word. He laughed coldly. Since the Kenshin does not care about their lives, then how can we let them continue to live? 5 days later, the Western Army had taken over the Yuanshan region, near the Chioluan region, and saved the people there. The night that they took over the Yuanshan region lord, the Internal Affairs Commander led the Western conquering army to chase up. The two armies were very close, only 100,000 miles apart. However, the Western Army acted like they did not know and continued to travel at a normal speed. As long as the Western conquering army under the Internal Affairs Commander rushed in front of them, they would be able to successfully ambush them. On the surface, it seemed like victory was within their grasp. Not only was Inextinguishable Azure filled with anticipation, but the 8,000 soldiers were also pumped up and filled with fighting spirit. However, the Internal Affairs Commander was a cautious person and was a little suspicious. Seeing that they could intercept the Western Army, He frowned and pondered for a long time, unable to make up his mind. Inextinguishable Azure saw his hesitation and asked him what was going on. The Internal Affairs Commander frowned and said, "I feel that something is not right. The Western Army is behaving too normally. Don't you think it is strange?" Inextinguishable Azure nodded. Yes. They had already suffered once, and their losses had been so disastrous. If it were anyone else, they would be more cautious and careful. However, they acted as if nothing had happened. Are they fools? Can't they guess that we will make a comeback? Or maybe there is an expert who sneaked into the army, so they are fearless? The Internal Affairs Commander frowned even more and muttered to himself, "Other than the Kenshin, who else can make them so confident and fearless?" But the Kenshin is still with the Northern Army. He even appeared in front of everyone yesterday. Yesterday, he received a secret message saying that the Northern Army had conquered a certain territory yesterday. The Kenshin even watched the Territorial Lord recite the oath of surrender in front of everyone. Inextinguishable Azure thought for a moment and said solemnly, "Commander, this is a serious matter. It is reasonable for you to be more cautious and consider it more carefully. I have a suggestion. Since you are worried that there is an expert in the Western Army, we might as well follow the Western Army and not attack in a hurry. When we find an opportunity, we can capture a few generals of the Western Army and torture them to get the answer." The Internal Affairs Commander's eyes lit up. He nodded and said, "That is a good idea. If there is a mysterious expert or Kenshin in the Western Army, the patriarchs and their god-kings will definitely know this secret." The two thought that they had thought of the best way to verify it and waited patiently for the opportunity. 4 days later, the Western Army entered the soul-shaking territory and arrived at the Territorial Lord's manor. More than 2,000 soldiers appeared and surrounded the Territorial Lord's manor. Patriarch Wanyan led several patriarchs and a large number of god-kings to negotiate with the Territorial Lord. More than 2,000 soldiers and dozens of god-kings stayed outside the Territorial Lord's manor. The Internal Affairs Commander and Inextinguishable Azure finally found an opportunity to sneak into the Territorial Lord's manor and capture 2 god-kings. The 2 lower god-kings were not very powerful. They were deacons of the ancient clans. The great commander of internal affairs and deep-tide indestructible had secretly abducted the 2 god-kings and interrogated them with torture. The 2 god-kings were tortured until they were half dead and had no choice but to tell the truth. It turned out that the Kenshin did not like the Western Army. The Kenshin had already made it clear that they would not come to their aid. The Internal Affairs Commander and Inextinguishable Azure were completely relieved after they heard the answer. They quickly informed the Western Army, who was hiding in the distance, to rush to the Territorial Lord's manor and set up a formation to surround and kill the Western Army. Chapter 4150. The Domain Master's mansion of the soul-shaking territory was located in a beautiful alternate space. More than 2,000 soldiers stood guard outside the secret realm, guarding the entrance and exit. Clan leader Wanyan led several clan leaders and more than 30 supreme gods into the Mystery Land to negotiate with the Domain Master. After 2 hours of negotiation, the Western Army had successfully subdued the Domain Master. Hence, the soul-shaking territory was declared to be part of the Rebel Alliance's sphere of influence. Clan leader Wanyan and the rest were emotionless. They took their leave calmly. However, when they arrived at the entrance of the Mystery Land, a general came up to them anxiously and reported to the Wanyan clan leader. Reporting to the Wanyan clan leader, "We just found out that 2 deacons are missing." Suddenly hearing this news, the patriarchs were all shocked, revealing puzzled expressions. Only the Wanyan clan leader narrowed his eyes. A smug sneer flashed across his eyes. However, he still pretended to be worried and anxious. He quickly asked for details. "Who are the 2 deacons? When did this happen? How did they go missing?" The general reported everything he knew in full detail. Unfortunately, the crowd still did not know how those 2 attendants had disappeared, and who had captured them. The few clan leaders finally reacted, and their expressions became somewhat solemn. "Oh no, it's most likely the commander of internal affairs has brought 8,000 elite soldiers to ambush us again. The domain master has no time or motive to attack our deacons. This must be the work of the Western Punitive Army. What are you waiting for? The Western Punitive Army is here to kill us. Why don't you leave?" The few clan leaders panicked and urged clan leader Wanyan anxiously. Clan leader Wanyan only wanted to laugh in his heart. He was even filled with anticipation as he subconsciously looked around. "Alliance Master, although you haven't contacted me or shown your face for the past 10 days, you must have guessed that you are here. But I'm guessing that you must have been here a long time ago, hiding nearby and observing the situation in secret." This was just clan leader Wanyan's guess. However, he was confident enough to believe that it was true. However, he still had to put on an act. He could not reveal any flaws at this moment. His face was filled with worry as well. He hurriedly led the patriarchs and godkings to join up with the army. "Quick, gather the army and board the battleship. We need to leave this place quickly." Following his order, more than 2,000 soldiers surrounding the secret realm immediately retreated at the fastest speed and hurriedly entered the warships. However, before everyone could enter the battleship, a dazzling divine light lit up in the sky 10,000 miles away. Several dozen divine king powerhouses, leading more than 7,000 divine lord experts, were currently rushing over in a grandiose manner. That scene was like a black cloud that blotted out the sky and covered the sun. It was surging and overflowing. Clan leader Wanyan and the others had interacted with the West conquering army before. They could tell at a glance that the surging torrent was none other than the Western Expedition Army. All of a sudden, the faces of the clan leaders turned pale, and their expressions became extremely ugly. "It's over. As expected, the Western Punitive Expedition Army is here. They didn't set up an ambush on our path, but charged straight at us. There's nothing we can do about it. The Western Punitive Expedition Army has 3 times the number of our men. They have an overwhelming advantage. There's no need for an ambush. What should we do? It's too late for us to escape. Are we going to fight them here? Why don't we retreat to the territorial chief's manor and ask the territorial chief to mobilize his men to help us resist the Western Expedition Army?" "That's right. The territorial chief has just joined our alliance. He can't just stand by and watch us die. He has to fight alongside us." In just a few breaths, the clan leaders communicated through telepathy and came up with a countermeasure. It was absolutely impossible to fight the Western Expedition Army head-on. They could only retreat to the territorial chief's manor and join forces to resist the Western Expedition Army's attack. That way, their chances of survival would be higher. However, clan leader Wanyan thought that there was no need to do so. With Kenshin watching from the side, the Western Expedition Army would be fine. Moreover, it was embarrassing to let Kenshin see their cowardice. However, Kenshin had not appeared yet, and clan leader Wanyan could not reveal this secret. He could only comply with the clan leader's suggestion and order everyone to retreat into the secret realm. Soon, 2,500 soldiers from the Western Expedition Army retreated into the secret realm and closed the entrance. However, the commander of internal affairs and Kanglin Immortal had already led 8,000 soldiers to the entrance of the secret realm. Seeing that everyone had retreated into the secret realm, the commander of internal affairs was not worried. Kanglin Immortal also sneered contemptuously. "Haha! What a bunch of cowardly stray dogs that don't know what to do in a panic. Do you think you'll be safe if you return to the secret realm? This is like catching a turtle in a jar." The commander of internal affairs stroked his beard and sneered. "After killing the Western Expedition Army, we'll kill the traitor, the territorial chief. In this battle, we must annihilate all of them. Only then can we make a name for ourselves and intimidate the world. After that, He waved his hand and gave the order to attack. Within the army, over 30 god-kings immediately led over 3,000 godlords to attack the entrance of the secret realm. The entrance of the secret realm was protected by a mid-king level seal array. It was indeed difficult for ordinary low-level and mid-level supreme gods to break through the array and enter the secret realm. However, the combined attack of more than 30 supreme gods and 3,000 soldiers from the Western Expedition Army was extremely powerful. Even though there were hundreds of soldiers from the Western Expedition Army supporting the array at the entrance of the secret realm, it was useless. Boom, boom, boom. Divine light and shadows poured down from the sky like a flood, violently bombarding the array at the entrance of the secret realm. The mid-king level seal array lasted less than 2 breaths of time before it was smashed into pieces, creating a huge crater. Countless fragments of divine light burst out and danced in the air. The 200 or so soldiers from the Western Expedition Army who were supporting the array were either killed or injured. They fell to the ground at the entrance of the secret realm. A huge gap appeared in front of the Western Punitive Expedition Army. Without needing the commander of internal affairs to give the order, thousands of soldiers from the Western Expedition Army swarmed into the secret realm like a flood. The commander of internal affairs and Kanglin Immortal walked through the gap and stepped into the secret realm. This secret realm with a radius of 100,000 miles was quite beautiful, and the spiritual chi of heaven and earth was abundant. However, at this moment, the peaceful secret realm was shrouded in a murderous and desperate atmosphere. More than 2,000 soldiers from the Western Expedition Army were fleeing to the Territorial Chief's manor as fast as they could to seek help from the Territorial Chief. Behind the Western Expedition Army, the commander of internal affairs led 7,000 soldiers from the Western Expedition Army to the Territorial Chief's manor. They were like a tidal wave that could topple mountains and overturn seas. He only left a few thousand soldiers to guard the entrance of the secret realm to prevent the Western Expedition Army from escaping. In everyone's opinion, the Western Expedition Army had the entire situation under control and could easily crush the Western Expedition Army and the Territorial Chief's manor. Translator, Transin Editor, Transin. Chapter 41-51. The ruler of the soul-shaking dominion was sitting in his study with a gloomy face. The attitude of the Western Road Army was very tough. He had no choice but to surrender. However, he could not get any benefit. He still had to carry out the task ordered by the Rebel Alliance and bear the anger and revenge of the Imperial Tutor. While the Western Road Army was gone, he could complain alone in the study. After complaining, he still had to carry out the order and restore the freedom of the people of the soul-shaking dominion as soon as possible. However, to the ruler of the soul-shaking dominion's surprise, 2 guards rushed to him and reported that the Western Road Army was back. Moreover, the Western Road Army was fully armed. It seemed that they were fighting someone and were driven back. What? They're back? And they were driven back? The ruler of the soul-shaking dominion was a little dumbfounded. He asked in confusion, "They just came out of the arcane land. How could they be driven back? Who drove them back?" The guard did not know either. He could only shake his head blankly. At this time, another guard rushed into the study and shouted anxiously, "My lord, bad news! The Western Road Army is being hunted down. Gather all the people immediately and fight side by side with them to resist the enemy's attack." What? They're really being hunted down? The ruler of the soul-shaking dominion's face changed dramatically. He stood up suddenly. He frowned and his eyes flickered. In a flash, he vaguely guessed who was chasing the Western Road Army. Now on the boundless heaven continent, only the Imperial Tutor's soldiers have the strength and motive to chase the Western Road Army. Don't tell me they're really coming? Thinking of this, the ruler of the soul-shaking dominion's mood became heavier. He rushed out of the study and ordered, "Pass down the order. Gather all the guards and be on full alert." He was not sure what had happened. Naturally, he would not let his soldiers fight. However, the situation was complicated. He had to let his soldiers be on full alert in case something unexpected happened. Soon, the ruler of the soul-shaking dominion left the study and rushed to the conference hall. At this time, thousands of soldiers of the Western Road Army had gathered in the square outside the conference hall. Clan leader Wanyan and a few other clan leaders, as well as many god kings, rushed into the main hall. Seeing the soul-shock domain lord appear, the patriarchs hurriedly called out to him and gave him orders. Soul-shaking region lord, quickly gather your troops and prepare for battle. Soul-shock domain lord, why are you so slow? Get your soldiers to assemble. For a long time, the patriarchs of the ancient clans had a sense of superiority that came from the bottom of their hearts. They believed that they were nobler than the domain lords. Therefore, they had a condescending attitude towards the various region masters. Now they belonged to the rebel alliance and were the generals of the Western Army. They had just forced the soul-shaking domain master to surrender, so they had no qualms about giving orders to him. However, soul-shaking area master was very unhappy. He ignored the other clan leaders and went straight to clan leader Wanyan. He asked, "Clan leader Wanyan, what happened? Who are you being hunted by?" Clan leader Wanyan didn't beat around the bush and directly replied, "The great commander of internal affairs and Kanglin Immortal led 8,000 elites to attack. Startling Soul Region Lord, you've already joined our alliance. It's time for you to show your loyalty." In fact, clan leader Wanyan said this to test soul-shaking area master's loyalty and also to remind him. Clan leader Wanyan still believed that Kenshin must be secretly observing. If soul-shaking area master made a mistake and made the wrong choice, then he would be in big trouble. Unexpectedly, soul-shaking area master was stunned. His eyes widened and he stared at clan leader Wanyan in disbelief. The great commander of internal affairs and Kanglin Immortal? 8,000 elite soldiers? Are they the army sent by the imperial tutor to intercept and kill you? When did this happen? Why did it happen to me? Soul-shaking area master was so shocked that he blurted out his inner thoughts subconsciously. In fact, he didn't care whether the Western Army could survive or not. He just felt unlucky, aggrieved, and depressed. Why did this kind of thing happen to his domain lord manor? Clan leader Wanyan didn't say much. He just patted soul-shaking area master on the shoulder and gave him a meaningful look. Don't be in a daze. Carry out the order quickly. He was already being extremely benevolent by reminding her to this extent. If soul-shaking area master still didn't know what was good for him, then he had no one to blame but himself. Soul-shaking area master's expression became extremely ugly. He slowly turned to look in the direction of the entrance of the arcane realm. When he saw thousands of soldiers of the Western Punitive Expedition in the sky thousands of miles away, he felt as if he had been struck by lightning. It turned out that clan leader Wanyan didn't lie to him. There were indeed 8,000 elite soldiers coming to attack and were about to surround his domain lord manor. Not only the Western Army, but he was also in big trouble. What should he do? Was it too late to escape now? This was the first thought that came to soul-shaking area master's mind. However, as soon as this thought flashed through his mind, he immediately sobered up. There was no way he could escape from the 8,000 elite soldiers surrounding his domain lord manor. Clan leader Wanyan and more than 2,000 soldiers of the Western Army were watching his every move. If he didn't save them and fled at the last minute, the Western Army would definitely report it to Kenshin. So far, there hadn't been a traitor in the rebel alliance. No one knew what the consequences of violating the oath of surrender would be or how the Kenshin would punish the traitor. However, soul-shaking area master didn't want to try and take the risk. After hesitating for a moment, he said to clan leader Wanyan, "Clan leader Wanyan, I've just ordered the soldiers to gather. Once they've gathered, I'll follow your orders and assist you in the battle." Soul-shaking area master was still sober and knew what to do. Moreover, this battle was obviously going to be lost. If he handed over the command to clan leader Wanyan, he could just cooperate and avoid punishment. Even if the entire army was wiped out and only the divine kings escaped, he wouldn't be punished by Kenshin in the future. Of course, at this critical moment, clan leader Wanyan couldn't be bothered to point out his little scheme. Soon, more than 2,000 soldiers of the Western Army formed a battle formation outside the Domain Lord Manor, ready to fight to the death. 8,000 soldiers of the Western Army also came and surrounded the Domain Lord Manor. The huge encirclement surrounded the dozens of mountains and thousands of people of the Domain Lord Manor. The 2,000 soldiers under Soul-Shaking Area Master's command had finally gathered. Under the command of Soul-Shaking Area Master, these soldiers joined the battle. Some of them operated the array while others formed the battle formation. The two sides were in a stalemate, ready to fight at any time. At this moment, the commander of internal affairs and Kanglin Immortal walked out of the crowd and looked down at clan leader Wanyan and Soul-Shaking Area Master with a sinister smile. Chapter 41-52. Although the two sides had met in the previous ambush, Lin Mingya and Lin Mingya had met each other in the last ambush. There was nothing much to say when they met again this time. They just had to kill. After all, everyone was well aware of each other's intentions and situation. But it was slightly different this time. After all, it was in the Soul-Shaking Domain Master's manor, and the Soul-Shaking Domain Master was involved. Therefore, the commander of internal affairs had to show his face and say a few words to the Soul-Shaking Domain Master. Soul-Shaking Domain Master, you should have seen me before, right? The commander of internal affairs ignored clan leader Wanyan and the others. He stared straight at the Soul-Shaking Domain Master with a cold smile. The Soul-Shaking Domain Master immediately became the focus of everyone's attention. Under the gaze of countless people, he subconsciously took a step back. He had no choice. He was sandwiched between the Imperial Tutors faction and the Kenshin's faction. He was the weakest and had the least choice. In the face of the commander of internal affairs questioning, he could only choose to remain silent. The commander of internal affairs continued, His Majesty the God Emperor and the Imperial Tutor treated you well. They gave you the position of Domain Master and let you reap a lot of benefit. But you failed to live up to the trust of the God Emperor and the Imperial Tutor. You actually became a traitor. Unfortunately, I'm going to make an example of you today. I'm going to kill you and all the soldiers under your command. This is the so-called killing the chicken to warn the monkey. I'm going to let those who have bad intentions and waver see that this is the result of betraying the God Emperor and the Imperial Tutor. The Soul-Shaking Domain Master's face suddenly turned pale. Cold sweat broke out on his forehead, and deep fear and despair flashed in his eyes. If he could, he really wanted to surrender to the commander of internal affairs. It didn't matter if the soldiers under his command were killed, as long as he could survive. But he had just turned to the Rebel Alliance today and swore an oath of surrender. If he changed sides now, he would definitely become the laughingstock of the world. What's more, the commander of internal affairs might not accept his surrender. He would still kill him to show his power. At that time, even his death would be worthless and meaningless. After death, he would be spurned by the world. Therefore, Soul-Shock Domain Lord chose to endure the attack with all his might. He braced himself and pretended to be righteous as he said loudly, Chief Commander, even if you have the advantage, even if I die here today, I will not surrender. That's because I've long wanted to abolish slavery and return freedom to the common people. It's just that I'm alone and weak, so I don't dare to voice my thoughts. Since there are Kenshin raising their arms and calling for the brave resistance against the God Emperor and the Imperial Tutor to save the people of the world, I will naturally follow their orders. As the ruler of a region, it is my duty to plead for the people. Even if I die, it's worth it. Sure enough, the Soul-Shaking Domain Lord's words made everyone's blood boil. Thousands of soldiers were moved. Regardless of whether his words came from the bottom of his heart, the fact that he said it in front of everyone meant that he had made his stand clear. The great commander of internal affairs didn't say anything else. He sneered and said, "Very good. Since you still have some backbone, I'll give you a dignified death." As soon as he finished speaking, he waved his hand and gave the order to attack. The 8,000 soldiers of the Western Punitive Expedition, who had been ready for a long time, immediately let out an earth-shattering roar. They performed their divine powers in unison and attacked the Domain Lord's manor from all sides. Suddenly, tens of thousands of divine powers covered the sky and the entire Domain Lord's manor. 2,000 guards of the Domain Lord's manor and 2,000 soldiers of the Western Punitive Expedition were all covered by the divine light. Countless people looked worried, anxious, and pessimistic. Their hearts were heavy. They all knew that there was no hope of winning this battle. However, it was useless to be pessimistic. Even if they knew that they were no match for the enemy, they couldn't just sit and wait. They had to fight back with all their might. Clan leader Wanyan, the other clan leaders, and the soul-shaking Domain Lord took the lead and rushed out. They shouted and performed their divine powers to resist the enemy's fierce attacks. Influenced by their momentum, the soldiers of the Western Punitive Expedition and the 2,000 guards of the Domain Lord's manor also became excited and united. Thousands of warriors, with a solemn and resolute mood, performed their ultimate skills with all their strength and launched a counterattack. The first round of battle between the two sides had begun. Boom, 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 boom. Deafening noises exploded between heaven and earth, causing the earth to tremble. The divine light in the sky collided violently and collapsed on the spot, bursting into billions of fragments. The violent and raging shockwaves hit the Domain Lord's manor and the mountains and rivers within a radius of 30,000 miles. The defensive array of the Domain Lord's manor had been activated. However, the layers of mediocre king-level divine array could not withstand the shockwaves of more than 10,000 experts. It only lasted for 2 breaths before it shattered. The first round of battle ended with casualties on both sides. However, the casualties on the Western Punitive Expedition's side were relatively light. Only a little more than 100 people were killed and 200 were injured. On the other hand, more than 300 guards of the Western Punitive Expedition and the Domain Lord's manor were killed and nearly 700 were injured on the spot. It was only the first round of battle, but the Western Punitive Expedition and the Domain Lord's manor had suffered such heavy casualties. This showed how big the gap in strength between the two sides was. In particular, the Western Punitive Expedition had destroyed the defensive array of the Domain Lord's manor in the first round of battle. This was very unfavorable for the Western Punitive Expedition and the Domain Lord's manor. Now that they had lost a layer of protection, their casualties were bound to be greater. More than 4,000 soldiers were filled with worry and despair. The various clan leaders and the Domain Lord's manor lord were also nervous. They were secretly thinking about how to deal with this and when they could find a way to escape. Clan leader Wanyan was the only one with the most complicated feelings. He pretended to be calm and collected, but his heart was full of doubts. He secretly looked around. He wondered if his prediction was wrong. Did the Kenshin not come? If so, did it mean that he had guessed wrong from the beginning? Or, did the Kenshin think that these casualties were nothing and that it was not time to strike? If it was the latter, clan leader Wanyan could accept it. However, if it was the former, then he was very disappointed and desperate. The Western Punitive Expedition's morale was greatly boosted. They shouted and launched the second round of attack. More than 7,000 soldiers brandished their swords. The Kenshin soldiers were murderous as they cast divine spells and released divine light illusions that blotted out the sky. The Western Punitive Expedition and the Domain Lord's manor guards, who were about to be drowned by the divine light, could only anxiously and desperately use their trump cards. Everyone knew that it was useless. It was still impossible to stop the siege of the Western Punitive Expedition. At most, it could only delay the speed of their defeat. However, at this point, they had no other choice. The divine light flood was about to engulf the Western punitive expedition and the Domain Lord's manor guards. In the second round of battle, they would definitely lose more soldiers. The number of survivors would drop to about 3,000. Next, everyone could imagine that in less than 15 minutes, the Western punitive expedition and the Domain Lord's manor would be killed and destroyed. However, at this moment of life and death, a scene that no one had expected occurred. A handsome young man in a white robe suddenly appeared in the sky above the Domain Lord's manor. Chapter 41:53. Who would dare to barge into a battlefield where tens of thousands of people were fighting? There were only two possibilities. Either they were stupid enough to court death, or they were unbelievably strong. That handsome young man with a mysterious and dignified aura was obviously the latter. There were only a handful of people in the world who dared to ignore the simultaneous attacks of thousands of experts. Other than the 5 god emperors, there was only one person who could do it. When everyone looked up at the white-robed young man, a name appeared in their minds. Kenshin. That's right, only he could do it. Even if the imperial tutor was a peak divine king, he couldn't do it, even though most of them had never seen Kenshin's face with their own eyes. But the commander of internal affairs, Kanglin Immortal, clan leader Wanyan, and the other clan leaders had all seen Ji Tianqing before. The moment they recognized Ji Tianqing, everyone was shocked and had different expressions on their faces. Clan leader Wanyan was pleasantly surprised at first, then he revealed a smile that said, "It's just as I expected." His face was filled with gratification and pride. The other clan leaders were pleasantly surprised at first, then they heaved a sigh of relief, their hearts finally settling back into their stomachs. They didn't dare to believe it, nor did they understand why Kenshin would appear here. Didn't Kenshin already say that he wouldn't help the Western army? But at this moment, they didn't have time to think so much. They only knew that since Kenshin was here, the Western army was safe. And the 8,000 soldiers of the Western expedition, the commander of internal affairs, and Kanglin Immortal were all doomed. As for the commander of internal affairs and Kanglin Immortal, they were filled with shock and couldn't believe what they were seeing. The same thought flashed through their minds at the same time. Kenshin? How can it be him? Isn't he leading the Northern Army to attack the city? How can he be here? This can't be real, this must be an illusion. Neither of them could accept this reality. Of course, everyone's reactions happened at the same time in an instant. At this moment, Ji Tianqing was doing something that left everyone dumbfounded. He actually opened his arms, and his body lit up with divine light. He erupted with his most powerful divine power and began to use his divine ability. He stood between the two sides, facing the 7,000 soldiers of the Western expedition alone. He actually wanted to resist and dissolve the attack of the Western expedition army with his own strength. With his own strength, he could resist the joint attack of more than 7,000 people. This was definitely a feat that shocked everyone's heart and made their jaws drop. Whoosh, whoosh. Ji Tianqing released a 5-colored light screen that spanned thousands of miles. It was like a giant whirlpool that spanned across the sky. The divine art of the Western Expedition Army to attack of the divine ability of the divine ability of the Western Expedition Army. Under everyone's shocked gaze, the divine light that blotted out the sky merged into the huge colorful vortex and turned into a huge ball of light. That solid, multicolored ball of light was at least 10,000 meters wide, like a small hill. Whoosh! Ji Tianqing turned his body slightly and pushed his hands behind him. Suddenly, the 5-colored vortex dissipated, and the mountain-sized 5-colored ball of light blasted into the distant sky like a cannonball. Boom! Crack! In the next moment, a huge hole was blasted in the sky tens of thousands of miles away, revealing a dark void. The 5-colored ball of light blasted into the void and disappeared. Just like that, the joint attack of the 7,000 soldiers of the Western Expedition Army was easily neutralized by Ji Tianqing. Such a move could only be described as divine. More than 10,000 people on the battlefield were dumbfounded. They stood rooted to the ground like statues. The battle paused just like that. After a while, everyone came back to their senses and let out excited cheers and exclamations. The Western Expedition Army looked terrified and worried, while the Western Expedition Army and the guards of the domain chief's manor were overjoyed. They were so excited that their blood was boiling. The Wanyan clan leader stroked his beard with a smile and commented, as expected of the peerless Kenshin, "Today I have seen Kenshin's moves with my own eyes. It is truly amazing." Ancient sayings once said that martial arts techniques could be used to deflect or borrow the force of others' attack. Kenshin used this move in his divine power. It is truly amazing. The other clan leaders nodded in agreement. They were not stingy with their praises for Kenshin. Ha ha! Kenshin's peerless reputation was earned through battle after battle. How can it be fake? Kenshin is the first person in history to be able to neutralize the joint attack of 7,000 soldiers alone. Not to mention Lord Alliance leader's strength and methods, just his domineering and heroic spirit of looking down on the world and surpassing everyone else is unparalleled. Deflecting 1,000 caddies with 4 tails? That's not quite accurate. If the 7,000 soldiers of the Western Expedition Army were 1,000 caddies, we are only deflecting 4 tails. Lord Kenshin is at least 500 caddies, right? That's right. That's absolutely right. Even if Kenshin did not use any clever means to neutralize the attack, he could still block it head-on. The army on the Western Road was jubilant. The soul-shaking domain master and his guards also looked relieved and completely at ease. Everyone felt that since Kenshin had appeared, there was nothing for them to do. Kenshin alone could kill all 8,000 soldiers of the Western Expedition Army. This sounded absurd, but to the sword god, it was as simple as eating a meal. It was a piece of cake. The Internal Affairs Commander and Kanglin Immortal were also in a mess. Their previous confidence and domineering attitude had disappeared. Their faces became very ugly. The two of them were uneasy. They were in awe and fear of Kenshin's power and means. If it were not for the tens of thousands of people watching, they would have turned around and fled. Unfortunately, no matter how flustered they were, they had to maintain a dignified posture. They could not show their fear. Otherwise, the morale of the 7,000 soldiers would be affected and they would collapse without a fight. Kenshin, you clearly led the Northern Army to attack the city. How could you appear here? Kanglin Immortal frowned as he stared at Ji Tianqing and asked in a low voice. Ji Tianqing glanced at him and showed a playful smile. Not long ago, someone asked me the same question, but he died soon after. Such an answer made Kanglin Immortal and the Internal Affairs Commander's expression change. That was because they all knew who Ji Tianqing was talking about. The Internal Affairs Commander frowned and thought for a moment. He immediately guessed the answer and asked with a dark expression. Kenshin, you must have used a doppelganger technique and left a doppelganger in the Northern Army to confuse us and make us make the wrong judgment. As for your true self, you have already secretly rushed over and joined up with the Western Army, am I right? Ji Tianqing smiled and nodded. That's right. You've guessed it right. Chapter 4154. In fact, the patriarchs of the Western Army and the ruler of the soul-shaking territory did not understand what was going on. From what they knew, Kenshin had always been in the Northern Army and could not have appeared here. Moreover, Patriarch Wanyan had told them that Kenshin clearly said that he did not have time and would not support them. At that time, the patriarchs were depressed and disappointed, thinking that Kenshin was biased and did not care about their lives. Now, after listening to the Internal Affairs Commander's analysis, they finally understood the truth. Immediately, the patriarchs felt somewhat ashamed. They blamed themselves and felt guilty for their misunderstanding of the sword god. The truth is that Kenshin did not care about our lives. We are also members of the Rebel Alliance. How could he let us be destroyed? I was thinking that we were ambushed and suffered heavy losses. Of course, it was a disgrace to the Rebel Alliance. With Kenshin's status and identity, how could he swallow this humiliation? Now the truth is out. Kenshin deliberately spread the news that he would not support us to deceive the Western Punitive Army and make them lower their guard. The Western Punitive Army was also afraid that Kenshin would support us, so they did not dare to make a move for so long. Not long ago, 2 of our deacons disappeared for no reason. It was definitely the work of the Western Punitive Army. The Western Punitive Army captured the 2 deacons and found out that Kenshin would not help them, so they decided to ambush us. That's right. Your analysis is absolutely correct. Kenshin guessed the Internal Affairs Commander's thoughts and plans and set up this trap in advance to lure the Western Punitive Army to kill us. He knew that the Internal Affairs Commander and the Imperial Tutor were cautious and suspicious. Not only did they deliberately spread the news, but they also left a clone in the Northern Army to show his face in front of everyone. All of this was to make the Western Punitive Army lower their guard. Not only is Kenshin's swordsmanship unparalleled, but his shrewdness and schemes are also amazing. That's right. We can only blame ourselves for being too shallow and ignorant. We wronged him. Just thinking about it makes me feel ashamed. The patriarchs discussed telepathically and quickly analyzed the cause and effect. They also understood Kenshin's plan and thought process. As a result, everyone's resentment towards Kenshin dissipated and turned into shame, gratitude, and admiration. Even though the great commander of internal affairs and inextinguishable Kanglan were nervous, the 7,000 soldiers of the Western Punitive Expedition were also under great pressure. Their hearts were filled with fear and awe. However, in the current situation, he was already riding a tiger and had no way to back down. The Minister of Internal Affairs knew that the Western Punitive Expedition could only advance and could not retreat. At the very least, they could not retreat without a fight. Otherwise, the morale of the Western Punitive Expedition Army would collapse on the spot and they would be chased down by the Western Punitive Expedition Army. Not to mention the fact that they could not escape the Kenshin's pursuit. Even if they could escape, they would face the Imperial Tutor's disappointment and punishment. After this defeat, the morale of the Imperial Tutor's army would be completely shattered. Since the Imperial Tutor, there was no one else who could lead an army into battle. Therefore, the Minister of Internal Affairs could only shout against his will to boost the morale of the Western Punitive Expedition. Officers and soldiers, you are all carefully selected by the Imperial Tutor and me. You are the real elites and mighty masters. Although everyone knows that the Kenshin is a peerless powerhouse and is famous for his fighting prowess, we should not be afraid. In today's battle, we should not be timid or afraid. We should be proud and excited. Think about it, to be able to fight a bloody battle with the Kenshin. Isn't that an honor for us? No matter how strong the Kenshin is, we have 7,000 soldiers. As long as everyone fights to the death, we will definitely be able to defeat the enemy. Everyone, don't worry. I will fight alongside you until the last moment. I will not retreat even if I die. His powerful voice reverberated in the sky, deafening everyone's ears. The 7,000 soldiers of the Western Punitive Expedition Army were affected by the Minister of Internal Affairs' aura. Their blood was boiling, and their fighting spirit was soaring. They also waved the divine weapons in their hands, shouting and roaring excitedly. Their bodies were filled with blazing fighting spirit. Seeing this, Ji Tianqing raised an eyebrow and his lips curled into a playful smile. Although the great commander of internal affairs appeared to be majestic and impassioned, the great commander of internal affairs' thoughts could not be hidden from him. He had already guessed what the Minister of Internal Affairs was going to do next. Therefore, he secretly transmitted an order to the Wanyan clan leader and the others. Half of the soldiers will follow me into battle and destroy the Western Punitive Expedition Army as soon as possible. The other half will immediately leave the domain chief's manor and rush to the entrance of the secret territory. Kill the Western Punitive Expedition Army guarding there and control the entrance as soon as possible. The Wanyan clan leader immediately gave the order to assign task. Under his command, the Wanyan clan and the other two clans stayed behind to fight. The other two clans and the guards under the domain chief's command rushed to the entrance of the secret territory. Seeing them fly across the sky and rush to the entrance of the secret territory, the 7,000 soldiers of the Western Punitive Expedition Army had complicated expressions on their faces. Just a moment ago, they were aggressive and had an overwhelming advantage. They could look down on the Western Punitive Expedition Army and the guards of the domain chief's manor. But now, the Western Punitive Expedition Army, backed by Kenshin, had ignored them and directly attacked the Western Punitive Expedition Army guarding the entrance of the secret territory. Although there were only about 1,000 soldiers left on the battlefield, they were all full of fighting spirit and confidence. They looked like they could easily crush the Western Punitive Expedition Army. There was no other reason other than the presence of Kenshin. The Minister of Internal Affairs saw that the situation was not good. Not only was the morale of his army declining, but the 1,000 soldiers guarding the entrance were also in danger. He quickly waved his divine sword and gave the order to attack. Kill! The 7,000 soldiers of the Western Punitive Expedition Army had been ready for a long time. When they heard the Minister of Internal Affairs' order, they immediately let out a deafening roar and took the lead in attacking. Another dazzling divine light shone. The divine light covered the sky and the sun, covering a radius of 20,000 miles. The Western Punitive Expedition Army's morale was high. The Minister of Internal Affairs and Kanglin Immortal also joined the battle and attacked Ji Tianxing with all their might. Their goal was clear. With the two of them as the leader and 20 divine kings, they would join forces to besiege Ji Tianxing. They did not expect to kill Ji Tianxing on the spot. As long as they could delay him, that would be enough. The remaining 7,000 soldiers would be able to kill the 1,000 soldiers of the Western Punitive Expedition Army very quickly. The Minister of Internal Affairs' plan was very clear. This plan was indeed feasible. But the problem was, he had absolutely no idea how formidable Ji Tianxing's strength was. Moreover, Ji Tianxing seemed to be alone, but he actually had a group of divine kings with him. Swoosh! Ji Tianxing opened the Jiutian 10 Absolutes Pagoda, and a blazing door of light appeared beside him. The next moment, Yun Yao, Ji Ku, Chao Qingyu, Lan Yank, Bai Feng, Lin Shui, and the others appeared. The 12 God King powerhouses were prepared long ago. As soon as they appeared, they waved their divine weapons and joined the battle. Their goal was very clear. They were to help the 1,000 soldiers of the Western Punitive Expedition Army resist the encirclement of the 7,000 soldiers of the Western Punitive Expedition Army. They did not need to kill the Western Punitive Expedition Army. They just needed to hold them off for a moment. Chapter 41:55. There were more than 8,000 people on both sides, and they started to fight again. The great commander of internal affairs and Kanglin Immortal led 20 God King experts to besiege Ji Tianxing in the sky. These 22 God Kings feared Ji Tianxing's fame and strength from the bottom of their hearts. Therefore, they didn't hold back at all when they attacked, using their trump card divine abilities. Everyone released all kinds of destructive divine techniques, which poured down like a torrential flood, drowning Ji Tianxing's figure. Ji Tianxing didn't hesitate. He immediately used the divine skill of 10 directional shadows and created 8 doppelgangers. The reason why he created 8 doppelgangers instead of 9 was because he left one doppelganger in the army on the north to act as a cover to deceive the Imperial Tutor and the Western Expedition Army. Whoosh whoosh whoosh. Ji Tianxing and the 8 doppelgangers spread out and used all kinds of divine skills and sword Dao skills at the same time to fight the commander of internal affairs and the others. The crisscrossing divine light phantoms flashed in the sky, and a series of earth-shattering noises reverberated. Violent shockwaves spread out in all directions along with countless fragments of divine light. The domain chief's manor, which was closest to the battle, was naturally unlucky. The mountains and dozens of palaces and mansions within 1,000 miles were flattened by the shockwaves and turned into a mess of ruins. Fortunately, before the battle began, the domain chief of the soul-shaking domain had asked more than 3,000 family members and servants to leave the domain chief's manor and hide in the depths of the mystic realm. Otherwise, the 3,000 people would have died in vain if the domain chief's manor was destroyed by the shockwaves. After 3 moves, Ji Tianxing gained the upper hand. The commander of internal affairs, Kanglin Immortal, and the 20 god kings couldn't hurt Ji Tianxing no matter how hard they tried. On the other hand, Ji Tianxing's divine skills could always break through their defenses and injure them one by one. In a short span of 10 breaths, 2 god kings had been killed by Ji Tianxing after exchanging over 20 blows. The other 9 divine king powerhouses were also injured by Ji Tianxing's clones, their bodies bathed in blood. In the sky, Ji Tianxing held the upper hand and the advantage. He attacked in the most violent manner, trying to finish off the internal affairs commander and the others as quickly as possible. In the sky and on the ground, Yun Yao, Ji Ku, and the others were helping nearly 1,000 soldiers of the Western Punitive Expedition Army to resist the encirclement of 7,000 soldiers of the Western Punitive Expedition Army. Even though they were all God King experts with extraordinary strength and were proficient in all kinds of divine abilities and ultimate arts, their battle prowess was outstanding. However, the West Punitive Expedition Army outnumbered them by 7 to 1. No matter how powerful they were, it was impossible for them to tie with the West Punitive Expedition Army. Other than the 5 god emperors and Ji Tianxing, almost no one could accomplish such a miracle. After the 2 sides fought for 10 breaths of time, the Western Army fell into a difficult situation. They kept shrinking their defensive circle, and moving became difficult. Of the 1,100 soldiers, more than 200 were injured and more than 60 were killed. Yun Yao, Ji Ku, and the others were worried, but they did not panic. They continued to deal with the situation calmly. In order to slow down the collapse of the Western Army and buy as much time as possible, they used their trump cards and life-saving divine artifacts. For example, Ji Ku controlled the 9 Heavens 10 Absolutes Pagoda to block most of the attack. This move was indeed effective. Although it could not completely prevent the Western Army from dying, it could at least significantly reduce the casualties. The earth-shattering battle lasted for 100 breaths of time before it reached its most intense moment. The surrounding tens of thousands of miles had become a battlefield. The mountains and rivers were destroyed, and the battlefield was littered with corpses and flesh. The battle between Ji Tianxing and the Internal Affairs Commander and the others was about to come to an end. The Internal Affairs Commander and Kanglin Immortal were both injured. Their clothes were tattered and their bodies were covered in blood. They looked rather miserable. Ji Tianxing had also killed more than half of the 20 intermediate and high-level god kings. Only 8 of them were still alive, but they were also severely injured. On the other hand, Ji Tianxing and his 8 clones were safe and sound. None of them were injured. After all, Ji Tianxing's true strength was more than 10 times that of an ordinary peak god king. Each of his doppelgangers had half of his strength, which was several times that of a peak god king. As for the Internal Affairs Commander, Kanglin Immortal, and the 20 god kings, none of them were peak god kings. The 2 strongest were only 9th heaven god kings. No matter what divine abilities or techniques they used, they would not be able to hurt Ji Tianxing. Unknowingly, another 30 breaths of time passed. The 8 severely injured god kings were also killed by Ji Tianxing and his 8 doppelgangers. They died tragically on the spot. Only the Internal Affairs Commander and Kanglin Immortal were still alive. However, their injuries had worsened, and their combat strength had decreased greatly. Both of them were filled with fear. They were very afraid of Ji Tianqing's strength and technique. If they continued to fight, the two of them would die under Ji Tianqing's sword in less than 50 breaths of time. Hence, the two of them very tacitly chose to turn around and flee. This was originally the plan that the two of them already decided on before the battle began. Taking advantage of the time when the battle was at its most intense, under the situation where the soldiers were not paying attention, the two of them fled quietly. The chances of success were very high. It was just that they did not expect that Ji Tianqing's strength was too horrifying, killing off all 20 God Kings so quickly. As such, the two of them felt that it was too late to escape now. The chances of success were not high. Whoosh! Whoosh! Taking advantage of the time when Ji Tianqing fired out 2 rays of fist light, blasting them out 1,000 miles away, the two of them immediately borrowed the force to retreat, turning around and fleeing towards the Mystic Realm's exit. Even if they were injured by the shock, blood spewing out of their noses and mouths, in order to not attract the soldiers' attention, the two of them forcefully endured it and did not make a sound. Furthermore, in order to increase the chances of successfully escaping, the two of them even teleported in 2 different directions respectively, pulling apart a distance of 20,000 miles in a blink of an eye. If it was outside the Mystic Realm, and there was only Ji Tianqing alone, then their scheme still had a chance of success. Regardless of which one Ji Tianqing chased, the other would escape. But now, everyone was inside the soul-shaking Mystic Realm. No matter how the Internal Affairs Commander and Navy Tide Immortal split up to escape, they still had to pass through the Mystic Realm's exit. Most importantly, Ji Tianqing was not alone. He still had 8 clones. Each doppelganger had the ability to defeat and kill the Great Commander of Internal Affairs and Kanglin Immortal. The 8 clones attacked at the same time, splitting into 2 to chase after them, quickly stopping them. Just like that, the Great Commander of Internal Affairs and Deep Tide Immortal were separated from each other and attacked by 4 clones. In less than 20 breaths of time, Navy Tide Immortal was killed by the 4 clones and turned into ashes. Following that, the Internal Affairs Commander also died under the swords of Ji Tianqing and the 4 clones, dying without a complete corpse. Ji Tianqing waved his hand and picked up the 2's Godhead fragments, turning around and rushing back to the battlefield. In the battle just now, the 7,000 Western Punitive Expedition Army did not suffer many casualties, only about 800 people were killed. The Western Punitive Expedition Army suffered heavier casualties. Even with the help of Yun Yao, Jiku, and the others, more than 400 people were killed, leaving only 700 people alive. Everyone was in a very dangerous situation, even Yun Yao, Jiku, and the others were injured. However, when Ji Tianqing rushed back to the battlefield and joined the battle, there was no suspense about the outcome. Chapter 4156. More than 6,000 Western Punitive Expedition soldiers surrounded more than 700 Western Punitive Expedition soldiers and Yun Yao, completely suppressing them. If it weren't for the supreme-grade divine artifact Jiutian Tenju Tower, those 700 people would have been killed long ago. However, after Ji Tianqing joined the battle with his 8 doppelgangers, the situation immediately reversed. The Grand Commander has already escaped and been killed by me. Do you still want to resist? The 8 doppelgangers waved their divine swords and rushed into the battlefield with murderous intent, slaughtering the Western Punitive Expedition soldiers. Ji Tianqing didn't forget to shout as he used his divine ability. His powerful voice covered the sound of the explosions caused by the collision of divine arts, allowing the 6,000 Western Punitive Expedition soldiers to hear it clearly. This sudden news caused the 6,000-plus soldiers to stiffen and their expressions to become extremely ugly. Countless people subconsciously turned to look at Ji Tianqing, or searched the surrounding sky for the Grand Commander of Internal Affairs and Kanglin Immortal. When they saw that the Grand Commander and Kanglin Immortal had indeed disappeared, they immediately panicked. Previously, the Grand Commander of Internal Affairs had said that he would fight side by side with them and would not retreat even if he died. In the end, before the battle had even reached its end, the Grand Commander and Kanglen Immortal had actually escaped. It was one thing to escape, but before he could do so, he was killed by the Sword God. What was this? This was too humiliating. This thought flashed through the minds of the thousands of Western punitive expedition soldiers. Their morale dropped by more than half, and they felt that there was no point in continuing to fight. There were also some soldiers who fell into hesitation and dilemma, considering whether to continue fighting or surrender to Kenshin. In their opinion, even the Grand Commander of the army had abandoned them and fled, so it was understandable that they would declare their surrender. Moreover, they were surrendering to Kenshin, so losing to Kenshin was not shameful at all. However, the 700 Western punitive expedition soldiers, Yun Yao, Jiku, and the others did not stop attacking. While the 6,000 Western punitive expedition soldiers were in a daze, everyone unleashed their divine abilities to counterattack. Boom, 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 bang, 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 bang. A deafening explosion erupted, reverberating endlessly between heaven and earth. Under the dazzling divine light, more than 800 soldiers of the Western punitive expedition were killed on the spot. Of course, nearly 500 of them were killed by Ji Tianxing and his doppelganger. With his and his avatar's strength and means, dealing with those divine Lord Realm Western punitive expedition army was simply like chopping vegetables. The heavily injured Western punitive expedition army immediately reacted, and many people subconsciously retreated. However, there were still many divine king generals in the West punitive expedition. They were still able to keep their cool and quickly shouted, "Everyone, don't panic! And don't believe Kenshin's nonsense. The chief commander and clan leader Kanglen would never do such a thing. The Kenshin wants to divide us so that they can annihilate us all. Right now, the only thing that can save our lives is ourselves. Don't retreat anymore. Only by breaking out of the encirclement will we have a chance to survive." The shouts of the generals spread through the crowd and calmed the hearts of many soldiers. The panicked Western punitive expedition army calmed down and began to methodically counterattack. Everyone knew that the chief commander of Internal Affairs and Kanglen Immortal had most likely been killed because they tried to escape, and that more than 6,000 of them could not escape this fate. But in the midst of despair, there was still a trace of hope and luck in their hearts. The only thing they could do was to fight back with all their strength and search for that trace of light in the darkness. And the result, if the 5,000 soldiers of the Western punitive expedition army were to escape, the name of the Kenshin would be ruined. With his strength, if he could not even kill these people, how could he take revenge on the 5 god emperors? In just a few minutes, the 5,000 soldiers of the Western punitive expedition army were slaughtered, and not a single one escaped. 70% of them were killed by Ji Tianxing and his 8 doppelganger, while the remaining 30% were killed by the Western punitive expedition army, Yun Yao, Jiku, and the others. After the battle ended, the divine light and loud noises that covered the sky gradually dissipated. Ji Tianxing recalled his 8 doppelganger and let Yun Yao, Jiku, and the others return to the Jiutian 10 Absolutes Tower to recuperate and rest. As for the Wanyan Patriarch and the 700 soldiers, they were also heavily injured. Ji Tianxing let them stay on the battlefield to recuperate and clean up. He turned and left the ruined battlefield alone and rushed to the exit of the soul-shaking secret realm. When Ji Tianxing arrived at the exit of the secret realm, the battle here was about to end. The Western punitive expedition army and the 1,000 guards under the soul-shaking realm's master besieged the 1,000 soldiers of the Western punitive expedition army guarding the exit. They had the advantage in numbers and the other side did not have any top expert. The result was obvious. When Ji Tianxing arrived at the exit, 80% of the Western punitive expedition army had been killed. Only about 200 people were left, and they were fighting and retreating. These Western Punitive Expedition Army were elite and loyal, but it did not mean that they were stupid. They knew that they were no match for the enemy and that defeat was inevitable. Of course, they would give up the exit of the secret realm and try their best to escape. However, the 2,000 soldiers of the Western Punitive Expedition Army chased after them and did not let them go. Ji Tianqing waved his hand again and unleashed sword lights that filled the sky. He used a few divine skills and killed the 200 soldiers of the Western Punitive Expedition Army. The battle here also came to an end. The disciples of the clans and the 1,000 guards of the soul-shaking realm's master manor heaved a sigh of relief. Ji Tianqing ordered the soul-shaking realm's master, "You take the guards under your command and guard here. Repair the exit array as soon as possible." This was the first time Ji Tianqing spoke to the soul-shaking realm's master. The soul-shaking realm's master was really flattered and quickly nodded. After that, Ji Tianqing led the disciples of the two ancient clans back to the ruins of the domain master manor. The people from the 5 clans gathered once again, but the number of people had increased from the initial 4,000 to more than 1,800. Even though the number of soldiers on the Western Front had decreased sharply and they had suffered heavy casualties. However, the main forces and pillars of the various clans were still there. As long as they added some more manpower, it wouldn't be a problem. Ji Tianqing asked the ordinary disciples of the clans to circulate their energy to heal their injuries. He summoned the patriarchs, elders, and deacons of the 5 clans. Everyone gathered together and stood respectfully, looking at Ji Tianqing with eyes full of excitement, gratitude, and worship. After this battle, their misunderstandings of Ji Tianqing were completely eliminated. At the same time, they were completely convinced by Ji Tianqing's shrewdness, strategy, and strength. Ji Tianqing calmly swept his gaze over the crowd and said, "Now that things have come to this, I believe that there is no need for this king to explain any further. Everyone understands this king's strategy and intentions. Before this, perhaps everyone would have some thoughts or even resentment. However, I will use my actions to prove that anyone who joins the alliance will be protected by the alliance. What you're worried about will never happen. After this battle, there is almost no one under the Imperial Tutor's command that can be used. The general situation is set. However, you must learn from this lesson and never let your guard down again." Chapter 4157. It was just as Ji Tianqing had said. Half of the boundless heaven continent was now under the control of the rebel alliance. Today, Ji Tianqing had killed the commander of internal affairs and Kanglin Everlasting. It would be difficult for the Imperial Tutor to find another expert of the same level who he could trust and who had the ability to stand on his own. It was expected that the next attack of the rebel alliance would be unstoppable, and the Imperial Tutor would be helpless. When the disciples of the 5 clans thought of this, they were all excited and full of expectations. But as Ji Tianqing had said, with this lesson, they had to be more cautious and not be careless. Although the Kenshin could save them once or twice, it was impossible for them to guard them all day long and save them 3 or 4 times. If they wanted to restore the reputation of the Western Road Army and impress the people of the boundless heaven continent, they had to show their true abilities. And the most important thing was that the clans had to transfer manpower to restore the 4,000 men of the Western Road Army as soon as possible. After Ji Tianqing spoke to the crowd, he gave a few words of advice to clan leader Wanyan before he turned and left. The clan leaders, elders, and deacons watched him float away, their hearts filled with excitement and joy. They could not calm down for a long time. When Ji Tianqing flew to the exit of the secret realm, he saw hundreds of seriously injured guards of the domain chief's manor healing their wounds. The soul-shaking domain lord ignored his own injuries and personally led hundreds of guards who were less injured to repair the grand formation at the exit. Noticing Ji Tianqing's arrival, the soul-shaking region's master and the guards hurriedly stopped casting and bowed respectfully. Ji Tianqing glanced at the domain chief and nodded slightly. "You're not bad. Keep working hard and don't let me down." After saying this, he left without looking back. But the domain chief was stunned in place, his face full of surprise and pride. A moment later, Ji Tianqing had already left the domain chief and disappeared into the sky. Only then did the domain chief come back to his senses. He pointed at himself proudly and said excitedly, "Did you see that? Kenshin. Kenshin spoke to me alone just now. He praised and encouraged me. Ha ha! Kenshin will remember me." The soul-shaking domain lord, who had always been solemn and dignified, was now as happy as a child. He was so excited that it was as if he had won a heaven-shaking prize. However, the guards beside him did not feel strange or awkward. They all nodded in agreement as they felt the same way. They were also a little excited as they exclaimed and praised him. "The domain lord is going to soar. This means that His Excellency's heroic performance has caught the eye of Kenshin. The region lord is mighty." To be able to obtain Kenshin's recognition and praise is definitely something that countless experts dream of. Although they knew that the guards were flattering him, they were also excited, envious, and amazed from the bottom of their hearts. Therefore, the soul-shaking domain lord was very happy and felt that the risk he had taken was worth it. After Ji Tianqing left the soul-shaking domain, he boarded the Godslayer battleship and rushed back to meet up with the Northern Army. At this time, his clone was still leading the Northern Army and was still conquering one region after another. Anyway, his clone also had the strength of a peak divine king. No one could tell if it was real or fake. Moreover, wherever the Northern Army went, those domain lords could not help but surrender when they heard the name of Kenshin. Who would dare to resist? 4 days later, Ji Tianqing met up with the Northern Army and withdrew his clone. Everything returned to normal. The Rebel Alliance's expansion did not stop. At this time, the news of the 8,000 Western Punitive Army besieging the Western Army but being completely annihilated by Kenshin in the soul-shaking secret realm spread again. This kind of major event and war was already very eye-catching. In addition, the Sword God had personally made a move, appearing and disappearing like a ghost. He had miraculously annihilated 8,000 soldiers of the Western Punitive Expedition, causing a huge commotion. For a time, the various regions of the boundless heaven continent were discussing and praising this matter. Not only the top powerhouses and factions, but even the hundreds of millions of civilians knew that Kenshin had once again created a miracle. As the related news spread, the cause, process, and twists of the matter were all restored. When the people of the boundless heaven continent knew about Kenshin's intentions and plans, they could not help but praise and respect him. At the same time, there was also a very influential rumor circulating on the continent. Kenshin has figured out the Imperial Tutor's nature and thoughts. He can already predict the future and guess the Imperial Tutor's movements and plans. In addition, the Rebel Alliance has taken over half of the continent. Kenshin's strength is also unparalleled. They are invincible below the 5 God Emperors. Obviously, Kenshin has completely grasped the initiative and the advantage. The Imperial Tutor is helpless and can only wait for his death. This rumor was the conclusion of some top powerhouses and divine kings based on what happened in the past 6 months. And this conclusion received the support and affirmation of hundreds of millions of people. At least 80% of the people on the boundless heaven continent were certain that the Rebel Alliance would win for sure. Kenshin would definitely unify the entire continent. The Imperial Tutor would definitely be defeated, and the speed would be very fast. Perhaps it would be soon. Similar rumors spread wildly on the boundless heaven continent, causing everyone to know about it. Therefore, the territories and civilians that had already belonged to the Rebel Alliance were naturally overjoyed and full of anticipation. The other half had not been subdued and was still under the control of the Imperial Tutor. It was a bleak and depressing scene. Even the tens of thousands of soldiers stationed in the Dark Knight domain became demoralized and dispirited. There were even deserters among the soldiers. Some soldiers quietly left the troops and disappeared without a trace. There were not many of these soldiers. They were divided into countless small teams, and their strength was more scattered. After they fled the Dark Knight domain, it was impossible for them to join the rebel alliance. But in their view, if they could leave the army under the imperial tutor as soon as possible, they could also save their lives in the future. Unknowingly, another month had passed. The development of the matter was just like the rumors circulating in the boundless heaven continent. The 5 clans of the Western Army transferred many of their disciples and recovered to 4,000 people. The rebel alliance's power did not weaken. Instead, its prestige increased. The 4 armies rushed about non-stop, successively subduing one territory after another. Today, 64 territories had already been subdued by the rebel alliance and were under the command of the Kenshin. Most of the territorial masters of these territories had joined the rebel alliance and also swore to be loyal to the Kenshin. Only a dozen or so territories had territorial masters who rebelled and were killed by the rebel alliance, and a new territorial master was chosen. Or, when the imperial tutor issued the order to assemble, those territorial masters rushed to the Dark Knight domain and gave up their territories. At this time, the rebel alliance could be said to be at the peak of its power, and victory was in their grasp. The imperial tutor's faction was suppressed to the point of being unable to breathe. The morale of the army was slack, and the territories were constantly shrinking. Finally, the more than 300 god kings and god generals under the imperial tutor could no longer sit still. Chapter 4158. In the past month, there had been constant rumors on the boundless heaven continent, and the situation had been worsening. The rebel alliance had won successive victories, and their reputation soared. Naturally, the tens of thousands of soldiers under the imperial tutor were holed up in the Dark Knight domain. Although it was said that they were waiting for an opportunity, it felt more like they were waiting for death. The morale of the army was low, and more soldiers were running away. The 300 divine kings and generals were worried, but they could not come up with a good plan. Helpless, they gathered together to discuss countermeasures, and finally unanimously decided to meet the imperial tutor. No matter how the outside world described Kenshin as brilliant and unparalleled, and how stupid and stubborn the imperial tutor was described as, in the hearts of these generals and divine kings, the imperial tutor was still their pillar of support for victory and survival. Late at night, the imperial tutor was in his residence as usual, cultivating in the secret chamber. Ever since he learned of a certain secret a few months ago, he had changed from a state of nervousness and anxiety to one of confidence, certainty, and leisure. No one knew why he was so confident and relaxed, and he had never explained the reason to anyone. At this moment, the guard outside the secret chamber reported loudly, "Lord Imperial Tutor, 12 great generals request an audience, and they are waiting for you in the study." The imperial tutor had more than 300 divine kings and divine generals under his command, but it was impossible for all of them to meet the imperial tutor. Therefore, they chose 12 divine generals and experts who had the highest status and were the most respectable. The imperial tutor was displeased that his cultivation was interrupted. He frowned and asked in a low voice, "I did not order them to gather for a meeting, what do they want?" The guard outside the door quickly replied, "Lord Imperial Tutor, they are indeed not here on orders, but they said that they have something important to discuss with you." The Imperial Tutor frowned and thought for a moment. He guessed the intentions of the 12 divine generals and divine kings, and could not help but feel displeased. Humph! These impatient fellows, how can they achieve great things if they are so impatient and rash after such a small setback? The imperial tutor cursed in his heart, and he felt a little sad. In the past, he had a few experts who were shrewd enough to accomplish great things and take charge of a region. But now, those experts had been killed by Kenshin, so he had no one to use under his command. With a sorrowful heart, the imperial tutor got up and left the secret chamber, hurrying to the study. A moment later, when he entered the study, he saw the 12 divine generals waiting for him in the study. These god generals were all high-level god kings. Some were commanders of a region, while others were leaders of primordial clans or peak forces. Although each of them had different appearances, their auras were very majestic, and their strength was not ordinary. Seeing the imperial tutor enter the study, everyone bowed in unison and said in unison, "Greetings, imperial tutor." The imperial tutor nodded slightly and walked to the throne expressionlessly. He calmly swept his gaze across the crowd and asked in a dignified tone, "What? After hearing some rumors and criticism outside, you can't keep your cool anymore?" The 12 god generals were stunned by the question. After looking at each other, someone immediately stepped forward and remonstrated. "Lord Imperial Tutor, we have indeed heard some rumors and criticism. However, those rumors have been circulating for a month, and everyone on the continent knows about it. Moreover, the criticism and slander among the people have caused great harm and humiliation to you. As the saying goes, if the master is humiliated, the servant will die. You are magnanimous and did not argue with the ants, but we cannot sit by and do nothing." Another immortal general also took a step forward, bowed and reported, "Lord Imperial Preceptor, if it's just rumors and slander from the outside world, we can just ignore them. An eagle naturally won't care about the ridicule of an ant. However, the entire boundless heaven continent is filled with such rumors, and the direction of the wind and the situation are all controlled by Kenshin. Now, our army's morale has been greatly affected, and the soldiers are all depressed and anxious. To tell you the truth, for the past month, the daily headcount has revealed that there are soldiers from various divisions who have fled." The third god general followed up and said, "Lord Imperial Tutor, a 1,000-mile dam can be destroyed by an ant's nest. You should know this better than us. If we don't think of a way to stabilize our army's morale, I'm afraid that before the 4 armies of Kenshin arrive, the soldiers will collapse without a fight. After all, those ordinary soldiers are definitely not as calm and confident as you." Following that, a few more god generals also spoke up to persuade the imperial tutor that it was time to take action and express his opinion. However, the imperial tutor listened quietly and did not express his opinion. After everyone had said what they needed to say and the study fell into silence, he slowly opened his mouth and said, "Are you done saying what you want to say? Is there anyone else who wants to add?" The god generals looked at each other and did not say anything. The imperial tutor's attitude made them feel uneasy. They were all worried that the goal of this trip would be difficult to achieve. As expected, the imperial tutor looked at them from the corner of his eyes and sipped his tea unhurriedly. He said, "You guys have been rambling about so much. It sounds like you have a good reason and the situation is very tense. However, in reality, do you think that you can hide your thoughts from me? Isn't what you really want to know the reason why I'm so fearless?" These few words poked at the god general's thoughts and caused their expressions to change slightly. However, 2 of the god generals reacted quickly and hurriedly bowed and explained, "Lord Imperial Preceptor is indeed wise and mighty, unparalleled in the world. Nothing can escape your eyes. However, we all know and believe that you have enough confidence and means to annihilate the Kenshin. However, the tens of thousands of soldiers under your command are stupid and do not know this. Lord, of course we believe in you. Including the 300 generals and god kings, we also have great confidence in you. However, no matter how hard we tried, we could not pacify the soldiers under your command. If we can't pacify the soldiers, they will not stop running away." Simply put, these god generals had their thoughts exposed by the imperial tutor and openly admitted it. They then shifted the blame to the soldiers and cleared themselves of all responsibility. The imperial tutor did not bother to expose them or reprimand them. He looked up and scanned the crowd. he saw that all the god generals were looking at him with burning eyes and full of anticipation. He knew that these god generals would not give up until they achieved their goal. Moreover, as the commander-in-chief, he had to consider the big picture. After hiding it for so long, it was time to let the generals know something to calm them down. Thus, the corners of the imperial preceptor's mouth curled up into a playful smile. He stroked his beard and asked everyone, "Right now, the sword god is in the limelight. His reputation is monstrous. The outside world is spreading rumors about how he is full of schemes, how powerful he is, and how he is unrivaled in the world. However, in reality, is he really invincible? Is his scheme really unbreakable and impossible to guard against? No. Let me tell you, in front of absolute power, his strength and schemes will become the biggest joke." Chapter 4159. In the end, the imperial tutor still did not clearly state what the trump card he was relying on for his confidence was. However, the 12 divine generals were not fools. From the imperial tutor's words, they had also caught some clues and vaguely guessed the answer. Kenshin was powerful enough, and his schemes and shrewdness were also deep enough. However, the imperial tutor said that in the face of absolute power, Kenshin was a joke. Then, who could compare to Kenshin in terms of absolute power? The answer was obvious. Thus, after the 12 divine generals guessed the answer, they all felt relieved. After chatting with the imperial tutor and discussing some minor matters, they all bowed and bade farewell, turning to leave the study. Of course, before the 12 divine generals left, the imperial tutor solemnly warned them. No matter what, they could not reveal this secret. The 12 divine generals naturally obeyed and expressed that they would not leak this secret. A few days later, the 12 divine generals commanded more than 300 generals to suppress and restrain the tens of thousands of soldiers under their command. After the strict military orders were passed down, the soldiers' discussions clearly decreased. Most of the negative, neglectful, and pessimistic emotions were also eliminated, and their morale had also clearly increased. Of course, these changes were all achieved under the 12 divine generals' unyielding orders. The answer they had guessed was not revealed to anyone. Even the 300 divine kings and generals did not know, let alone the tens of thousands of soldiers. As a result, there were still a small number of soldiers who were pessimistic and worried about the future. They did not believe that the imperial tutor had any hope of defeating Kenshin. Every day, some soldiers would still quietly escape, but the number was much lower than before. Every day, there were still soldiers discussing the situation in private and spreading the news of the rebel alliance's triumphant advance. However, the soldiers all suppressed it and did not dare to spread it widely, only discussing it in private. The 4 armies of the rebel alliance were as aggressive as ever, flattening everything in their path. The imperial tutor did not clearly state his position and was clearly in a passive state, with almost no one he could use. The entire boundless heaven continent's forces and powerhouses all saw it clearly. Everyone believed that the imperial tutor was determined to defend the Dark Knight domain and fight a final battle with the rebel alliance. In that case, before the final battle, the imperial tutor faction would not be able to fight back. Since that was the case, there was no need for the domain lords to resist. Everyone had the same mentality. Since the rebel alliance's army had arrived, they would first surrender to the rebel alliance and pledge their allegiance to the Kenshin. In any case, the imperial tutor doesn't care if we live or die, so there's no need to talk about loyalty. In the end, when the imperial tutor fought the rebel alliance, we would stand by and not interfere. If the rebel alliance wins, we will be safe. If the rebel alliance is defeated and the imperial tutor wins, we can say that we were forced into a corner. In short, these domain lords did not feel guilty. They were just waiting to see the results of the final battle. The 4 armies of the rebel alliance did not disappoint the people of the boundless heaven continent. In the next 4 months, almost every 2 or 3 days, there would be news of victory from one of the armies, announcing that a certain domain had been subdued. Of course, there were only about 40 domains left that had not yet surrendered to the rebel alliance. Among them, there were more than 20 domain lords who were loyal to the imperial tutor and the Azura god emperor. As early as a few months ago, when the imperial tutor ordered them to gather at the Dark Knight domain, they had already been ordered to rush to the Dark Knight domain. Their respective domains were in a state of emptiness and no one was defending them. Whichever army of the rebel alliance arrived, it was directly subdued. In fact, many forces that took advantage of the situation emerged in the domains abandoned by the domain lord. Every domain had a few top or first-tier forces, or clans and sects with a strong foundation. When the domain lords were in power, they could only obediently lay low due to the rule of the domain lords, the imperial tutor, and the Azura god emperor. But in this turmoil they saw an opportunity to rise. When they learned that the Rebel Alliance's army was about to arrive, the first-tier forces, clans, and sects of these domains actually expressed their welcome and surrender to the Rebel Alliance in advance. They were very willing to join the Rebel Alliance and swear to the Rebel Alliance that they were loyal to the Kenshin. The reason why they did this was very simple. It was to gain the recognition of the Rebel Alliance and the Kenshin and choose them as the new domain lords. After all, the Rebel Alliance had always done this. If any domain's domain lord fled, or if the domain lord resisted stubbornly and was killed, the Rebel Alliance would elect a new domain lord after subduing the domain. The newly elected domain lord did not need to be very strong, nor did they need to be very scheming and shrewd. The most important thing was that they had to be obedient and absolutely loyal to the Rebel Alliance and the Kenshin. This was not a difficult task for many forces, clans, and sections, and reality proved that the Rebel Alliance was very pleased with these smart and obedient forces. In the beginning, the first-tier forces of each domain, who were the first to surrender and swear loyalty to the Rebel Alliance, would be recognized and appointed as the new domain lords by the Rebel Alliance. Later on, when the news spread, it caused many regions to follow suit. In those domains that were abandoned by the domain lords and had no power, 3 or 4 forces actually appeared and surrendered to the Rebel Alliance at the same time and declared their loyalty. This made people not know whether to laugh or cry. The Rebel Alliance's army could not refuse the allegiance of several forces, so they could only choose the most suitable one to be the new domain lord. Later on, something even more laughable happened. The domain lord of a certain domain was still there, but several forces of that domain secretly contacted the Rebel Alliance's army and surrendered to the Rebel Alliance. Their attitudes were very sincere, and they swore to join the Rebel Alliance. They looked like they wanted the Rebel Alliance to immediately take out the oath of surrender. They did not hesitate and immediately read it out. This made the Rebel Alliance feel a little awkward, so they could only tactfully refuse their allegiance. But they insisted that the domain lord of that domain was hesitant and not decisive enough. It was obvious that he was not loyal to the Kenshin. But they were absolutely loyal to the Kenshin and would not have any doubts or reservations. If they were appointed as domain lords, they would do their best and carry out every order of the Kenshin. This series of actions made the Rebel Alliance's people dumbfounded. They could not help but exclaim that these people were really shameless. In order to fight for the position of domain lord, they did not even care about integrity. After the matter, the domain lord of that domain naturally surrendered to the Rebel Alliance. But after the news of several forces surrendering secretly spread, the domain lord was also very embarrassed and criticized. Thus, in order to restore his reputation, the domain lord could only restore the freedom of the people as quickly as possible. Moreover, he earnestly carried out the Rebel Alliance's orders and became more diligent and caring for the people. Chapter 4160. Unknowingly, 4 lively and noisy months had passed. In these 4 months, the Rebel Alliance was the well-deserved protagonist, leading the tide and dominating the boundless heaven continent. It was the main topic of discussion among millions of people every day. The people of the entire boundless heaven continent were praising the merits of the Rebel Alliance, and the courage and love of the cowardly Kenshin. After the people of the various regions that had long been ruled by the rebel alliance regained their freedom, not only did they take the initiative to destroy the statues of the Shura god emperor and the region lord, they also spontaneously built countless shrines to worship the sword god and created many exquisite statues of the sword god. Logically speaking, they had been oppressed for 1,000 years and had to work as coolies to plunder cultivation resources. They were forced to believe in the Shura god emperor and provide the power of pious faith. Now that they had finally regained their freedom, they hated worshipping statues, and even more hated worshipping and praying on time. However, the people worshipped and were grateful to Kenshin from the bottom of their hearts. The construction of the temples and statues was voluntary. Even the large-scale worship and blessing ceremonies were organized by the people spontaneously. They held all kinds of ceremonies mainly to thank Kenshin for saving them, and also to pray for Kenshin, hoping that Kenshin would live as long as the heavens and never be obliterated. Only in this way could Kenshin protect the people forever. Since ancient times, the people were the simplest, most honest, and kindest. They might not understand any great principles, nor did they understand what the big picture was. They only knew that whoever oppressed, squeezed, and enslaved them was their enemy. Whoever sympathized, pitied, and saved them was their benefactor. If this benefactor was only good to them, took them to heart, and did not ask for anything from them, then this person was a great saint, a savior. There was no doubt that Ji Tianqing was such an existence in the eyes of the people. After 4 months, the rebel alliance's results were remarkable. 42 more regions successively returned to the rebel alliance and pledged loyalty to Kenshin. At this point, 95% of the entire Boundless Heaven continent's territories were all under Ji Tianqing's command. He already became the master of the Boundless Heaven continent in name and in reality. However, the Dark Night domain and the 2 surrounding domains had yet to be conquered, so the war was not over yet. That night, the 4 armies of the Rebel Alliance merged and became 2 armies. The army led by Ji Tianqing from the north met up with the army led by Patriarch Wanyan from the west. The southern army led by Nangong Buhua met up with the eastern army led by Dugujan. One of the 2 armies was stationed at the border of the Overlooking Wind region, while the other was stationed at the border of the Origin Heaven region. The Overlooking Wind region and the Yuantian region were respectively on the left and right of the Dark Night region, like 2 most loyal guards, firmly protecting the Dark Night region. Even if the entire Boundless Heaven continent surrendered, these 2 regions' domain lords still resisted stubbornly to the end. At the border of the Linfeng domain, after the northern and western armies met up, Ji Tianqing personally led them. This army of more than 6,000 people was galloping through the night towards the central region of the Linfeng domain. With the experience and lessons of the past few months, even if the Rebel Alliance controlled the overall situation and victory was in sight, the soldiers did not dare to be complacent and did not lower their guard. The army's morale was still high, and they carried out their orders meticulously. On the god-slaying battleship, in Ji Tianqing's private room, he was sitting cross-legged on a prayer mat made of divine jade, quietly meditating and adjusting his breathing. But for some reason, he couldn't calm down tonight and felt a little restless. For an expert like him, such a situation rarely occurred. The previous 2 times it had occurred, it meant that his 6th sense had burst forth, and the heavens had given him some warning and premonition. Therefore, Ji Tianqing did not suspect anything and immediately realized that some kind of danger was about to appear. He thought to himself, "It has been exactly a year since the alliance was established. I have now conquered 97 domains, and only 3 are left. If I can successfully conquer these 3 domains and defeat the Imperial Tutor, it will be at least a year earlier than I originally expected." However, the Imperial Tutor has been too low-key in the past few months. If he didn't have any trump cards to rely on, he definitely wouldn't have waited for death in the face of the Rebel Alliance's aggression. Even if the experts under his command fell one after another, he would have thought of other ways to stall for time and weaken the rebel alliance's strength. But he didn't do anything. He just defended his base in the Dark Knight domain and watched as I killed my way to him. No one would believe that he didn't have any schemes or trump cards to rely on. Ji Tianqing thought to himself, apart from the Azura God Emperor, what other trump cards could the Imperial Tutor rely on? But the Azura God Emperor had clearly indicated that the mission of solving the mystery of the Grey Fog in the depths of the void was more important. He had no time to care about the lives of the Imperial Tutor and the others. Could it be that the Azura God Emperor will send an avatar back to support him? If that's the case, it's a normal reaction. No wonder the Imperial Tutor has such confidence and a trump card. However, when Ji Tianqing thought about it, he still felt that something was amiss. But even if the Azura God Emperor's avatar came back to support him, he wouldn't have enough confidence to defeat me and destroy the Rebel Alliance, right? The Azura God Emperor and the Imperial Tutor should know that I defeated several avatars of the God Emperor a few years ago. Even if the Azura God Emperor's avatar came, he wouldn't be able to defeat me. After careful consideration, a thought flashed through Ji Tianqing's mind. But he felt that this conjecture was too absurd. It shouldn't be possible, so he ruled it out. At this moment, the Wanyan clan leader's voice came from outside the secret room. Reporting to Lord Alliance Leader, we just received a message from Shemi Paradise, reporting the latest news. All the clan leaders have gathered in the conference room and are waiting for you to discuss the matter. Ji Tianqing acknowledged and let the Wanyan clan leader leave first. Then, he finished his meditation and left the secret room for the conference room. The clan leaders and sect leaders of the various forces were all present and were waiting respectfully. When they saw Ji Tianqing arrive, everyone greeted him in unison. After Ji Tianqing sat down at the head of the table, everyone sat down one after another. The Wanyan clan leader stood up, holding the message from Shemi Paradise in his hand, and announced the news to everyone. Cave Master Shemi's report was very detailed. Moreover, Shemi Paradise was the best at gathering information, so this news was also very reliable. The Cave Master's message was detailed and precise, which could also be understood as a rigorous and long report. The main meaning was that the 30,000 main forces under the Imperial Tutor were lying in ambush in the Dark Knight region. In addition, as the last two barriers to the Dark Knight region, the Overlooking Wind region and the Origin Heaven region also had a large number of troops lying in ambush. Among them, there were about 12,000 people lying in ambush in the Overlooking Wind region, and nearly 10,000 people in the Dark Knight region. These were the elites that the Imperial Tutor had transferred from the various regions. Most of them were divine lords, and there were dozens of divine kings overseeing the two regions. Chapter 4161. Ji Tianqing had long known that the Imperial Tutor had gathered nearly 500 god kings over the past year. Excluding the 100 or so god kings killed by the Rebel Alliance, there were still more than 360 god kings alive. Since there were more than 360 god kings, it was normal for the Imperial Tutor to transfer 100 god kings to guard the Linfeng domain and the Yuantian domain. If it had been half a month ago, when the four armies of the Rebel Alliance had not converged, it would have been very difficult to conquer the Linfeng domain and the Yuantian domain. At the very least, except for the northern army led by Ji Tianqing, it was impossible for the other three armies to defeat the enemy army of more than 10,000. Because of this, Ji Tianqing had already formulated a strategy to conquer all the regions around the Boundless Heaven continent first, and then approach the Anya domain. This method of extracting silk from a cocoon could slowly erode the territory and weaken the power of the Imperial Tutor. In the end, the Imperial Tutor would only be left with the Anya domain, the Linfeng domain and the Yuantian domain. Tonight, the patriarchs and sect masters came to the meeting to listen to Ji Tianqing's advice and guidance so that they could prepare and respond when they arrived at the domain master's manor tomorrow. After listening to Patriarch Wanyan's report, Ji Tianxing said calmly, "The Linfeng domain and the Yuantian domain only have more people guarding them, but there are no experts that are too difficult to deal with. The elite forces under the imperial tutor are concentrated in the Anya domain. Although the Linfeng domain and the Yuantian domain are fortresses and barriers for the Anya domain. But the imperial tutor does not have the courage to transfer more troops to support them, and it is impossible for him to personally take action. Therefore, although there will be a certain amount of danger and casualties when we attack the Linfeng domain and the Yuantian domain tomorrow, it will not be a big problem. You don't have to worry too much." Since Ji Tianxing said so, the patriarchs and sect masters were relieved and obviously much more relaxed. Then, Ji Tianxing deduced several possible situations and taught them how to deal with them. Everyone listened carefully and memorized it in their hearts. After a quarter of an hour, the short meeting ended. Everyone left the conference room one after another. Ji Tianxing also returned to the secret chamber to continue meditating. Clan leader Wanyan was in charge of recording the contents of the meeting just now. He mainly recorded what Ji Tianxing said and sent it to Nangong Buhua through a communication jade slip. With that, the army led by Nangong Buhua felt much more confident. They were filled with confidence and anticipation for the invasion of the Origin Heaven domain tomorrow. Time passed quickly. 20 hours later, the evening of the second day arrived. The fleet led by the god-slaying battleship flew across the sky and arrived at the domain chief's manor in the Linfeng domain. The domain chief's manor was located in a secret realm. The secret realm had a circumference of a few 100,000 miles. It was filled with abundant divine energy and resources. It could be said to be one of the best among the hundreds of secret realms, and it was only inferior to the blessed paradises. In addition, the downwind region was rich in resources, and the region master was the imperial tutor's most trusted aide. Therefore, the downwind region had always been very rich and affluent. The number of divine lord experts and divine king powerhouses was much more than other regions. The downwind region master hadn't left the domain chief's manor and gone to the Anya domain to avoid the disaster. As early as half a month ago, he had expressed his attitude to the imperial tutor and vowed to live and die with the soldiers of the downwind region. Even if he died on the battlefield, he wouldn't abandon the domain chief's manor, let alone surrender to the rebel alliance. His loyalty naturally made the imperial tutor feel very gratified and touched. Therefore, the imperial tutor sent a team of personal guards to bring the downwind region master's family and relatives to the Azura Divine Palace in the Anya domain. The imperial tutor wanted to express that he would do his best to protect the downwind region master's family and not distract him so that he could fight with all his strength. Another meaning was that even if the downwind region master died on the battlefield, the imperial tutor would take good care of his family. Of course, this was good, and the downwind region master was grateful. But like everyone else, he couldn't help but think that the imperial tutor had a third intention. That was to use the downwind region master's family as a shackle to force the downwind region master to fight and be loyal to his duty. To put it nicely, this was called encouragement, but to put it bluntly, it was a threat. The downwind region master understood it, but he didn't point it out. Instead, he was very grateful to the imperial tutor. Ever since his family was taken away, he had devoted himself to setting up defenses and preparing for the battle in the past half a month. Under his arrangement and command, 12,000 soldiers protected the inside and outside of the domain chief's manor. In addition to so many soldiers, he also led the soldiers to set up layers of defensive formations. In order not to affect the final battle, he also transferred all the servants of the domain chief's manor to other places. Now there were 4,000 soldiers outside the secret realm and 8,000 soldiers inside the secret realm. Apart from these 12,000 soldiers, there was not a single person who was not related to them. The downwind region master also wore armor all day and had a sword at his waist. He looked like he was ready to fight at any time and would never return. When the sun was setting, Ji Tianxing's god-slaying battleship arrived outside the domain chief's manor with several other battleships. A few hundred miles ahead, there was a giant mountain that was tens of thousands of feet high. The peak of the mountain was shrouded in a sea of clouds. In the sea of clouds, there was a square with a radius of 100 miles. A huge altar stood in the middle of the square. That was the entrance to the secret realm. A total of 4,000 soldiers in armor and holding swords were firmly guarding the square and the altar at the peak of the mountain. Among them, 2,000 soldiers stood in the open. Their bodies were like javelins and stone statues. The other 2,000 soldiers hid in the dark, ready to provide support at any time. The soldiers of the downwind region all knew that the army that was about to attack the domain chief's manor was personally led by Kenshin. Although everyone believed that Kenshin would take care of his reputation and attack openly instead of sneak attacks, the downwind region master was very cautious. However, the overlord of 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 the overlord region was extremely cautious. However, it turned out that he was overthinking. Swoosh, swoosh, swoosh. Just as everyone had guessed, the fleet led by the sword god openly appeared in the sea of clouds and stopped 100 miles away from the entrance of the secret realm. The god-slaying battleship was at the forefront, piloted by Bai Long. It opened its wings, revealing 600 flashing muzzles that were aimed at the square at the peak of the mountain. Ji Tianxing walked out of the battleship and stood high in the sky, looking down at the peak of the mountain and the entrance of the secret realm. Behind the god-slaying battleship, the 8 forces battleships were arranged in a wing shape, ready to attack. As soon as the two sides met, they were ready to fight. The atmosphere between heaven and earth seemed to have frozen, filled with murderous intent. Even though the soldiers of the Linfeng domain had expected this day to come and were mentally prepared for it, the Linfeng domain soldiers were still shocked. However, when they saw Kenshin appear with their own eyes, they couldn't help but feel terrified. They had no choice. Kenshin was too famous, and his power was too terrifying. In the past 4 months, Ji Tianxing often cultivated in the distorted time and space of the Divine Tower in seclusion. Not only did he refine all the divine spark fragments he had, but he also cultivated in seclusion for 10 years. Therefore, his strength had doubled, and his aura was even more unfathomable, like the power of heaven. Chapter 4162. On the plaza at the peak of the mountain, there were 2,000 guards on the surface, and another 2,000 guards were hidden in the dark. At this moment, everyone's attention was on Ji Tianxing. Everyone wanted to know what Kenshin was going to say and do. There were even a few guards who fantasized about how great it would be if Kenshin could sit down and negotiate with the territorial lord. Then the two sides would not have to fight, and they would not become dead souls under Kenshin's sword. Although everyone knew that this was an extravagant hope, the two sides were like fire and water, and there would be a battle. However, under Kenshin's prestige and the threat of death, they still could not help but feel that they were lucky. At this moment, Ji Tianxing looked down at the many guards with an indifferent expression and said in a cold tone, "Although it's useless for me to persuade you to surrender now, I still want to say it clearly. The Rebel Alliance is only fighting to save the people of the world and return peace and tranquility to the world, not to kill. As long as you immediately lay down your arms and surrender, I can spare your lives and let you go." Ji Tianxing's words were not only the original intention of the Rebel Alliance's establishment, but also the principle that the Rebel Alliance had always practiced. His original purpose was not to occupy the boundless heaven continent, to sit on hundreds of millions of people and endless resources, and to enjoy the glory and power of the position of overlord of the continent. He only wanted to destroy the foundation of the Azura God Emperor's power and save the hundreds of millions of people of the boundless heaven continent. Therefore, the Rebel Alliance occupied more than 90 regions in a short year, but did not waste time to consolidate control of each region, and did not plunder resources and wealth. It was also because of this that the people of the boundless heaven continent saw all of this with their own eyes, so they supported the rebel alliance so much and worshipped Ji Tianqing so much. The 4,000 guards on the mountain peak had a somewhat complicated look in their eyes when they heard Ji Tianqing's words. Many guards approved of Ji Tianqing and the rebel alliance from the bottom of their hearts, and also believed his words. If they had a choice, of course they would want to lay down their arms and surrender, and not die in vain. However, their status and situation had determined that they could only fight to the death here today. They could not surrender or run away. After a brief moment of silence, a guard commander flew out from the crowd and cupped his fists to Ji Tianqing. With a solemn expression, he said, "Although we are enemies and not friends, Kenshin's conduct is well known by the world. We naturally admire you and would like to thank Kenshin for giving us this opportunity. However, we have military orders and do not dare to disobey. We can only swear to uphold them to the death. Kenshin, sorry for the offense." After saying that, the guard commander drew his sword, raised his arm, and shouted, "Protect our homeland, we will not retreat even if we die." The 2,000 guards in the square also waved their swords and shouted. For a moment, the guards were in high spirits. Their morale had also increased by a lot. They were no longer as dispirited as before. Ji Tianqing didn't waste any time and immediately gave the order to attack. Thus, the god-slaying battleship and the 8 battleships on both sides launched the first round of attack. Boom, 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 boom. The 9 battleships activated their arrays at almost the same time, releasing more than 5,000 dazzling pillars of light. Like a rain of swords, they cut through the night sky and blasted toward the square on the summit. At that moment, thousands of dazzling pillars of divine power lit up the night sky for tens of thousands of miles. The dense rain-like pillars of light carried with them a destructive power that tore apart the barrier between the night sky and space, creating dense spatial cracks in the night sky. Naturally, the mountain peak with a radius of 100 miles also suffered a devastating blow. Although the 2,000 guards guarding the mountain peak had activated their defensive array in time, forming a huge defensive light shield. But when thousands of pillars of light blasted down, the defensive light shield didn't even last for a moment before shattering. Immediately after, the mountain peak was drowned in dazzling divine light and turned into endless ashes and dust on the spot, stirring up billowing smoke and dust. The entire mountain was destroyed and disappeared, leaving behind only a huge crater and ruins. When the pillars of divine power descended, the 2,000 guards didn't dare to escape due to military orders. They even joined forces to cast spells to resist. Unfortunately, their strength was too weak. Trying to resist the attack of the god-slaying battleship, a supreme-grade king-level divine artifact, was like a mantis trying to stop a chariot. When the billowing smoke and dust dissipated, the earth-shattering explosions gradually stopped. At that moment, the 2,000 guards on the mountain peak also disappeared along with the mountain peak. They didn't even have time to fight back. Under the simultaneous attack of the 9 battleships, they were turned into ashes and dust. Such terrifying power made the 2,000 guards hiding in the dark tremble with fear. They only wanted to turn around and run. Originally, they were hiding in the dark and wanted to use the power of the array to launch a sneak attack while the two sides were fighting. But they never expected that the battle between the 2,000 guards and the rebel alliance would end as soon as it started. The 2,000 guards on the square didn't even have a chance to fight back before they were blasted to pieces. How terrifying was that? At that moment, the 2,000 guards hiding in the dark finally understood the terrifying power and methods of the Kenshin. They also finally understood why the territorial lords of the more than 90 domains surrendered at the sight of the battle. They seemed to have no backbone and dignity. If they were in the same situation, they wouldn't care about dignity under the threat of death. Fortunately, the place where they were hiding was quite far from the square on the mountain peak. It was at least 10,000 miles away. Even if the mountain peak was destroyed and they were affected, they only suffered some injuries. They weren't killed. If they were closer, they would probably have been turned into ashes. Retreat! The guard commander ordered. He immediately led the 2,000 guards to retreat into the distance and escape from the battlefield. They had been hiding in the dark and hadn't shown their faces. Even if they turned around and fled now, they would do it secretly. It should be safer. At the entrance of the secret realm, above the ruins, clan leader Wanyan and the others looked at Ji Tianqing and asked, "Alliance leader, those 2,000 people hiding in the dark, should we, Alliance leader, please allow us to chase after them? I guarantee that we will finish them in an hour. Alliance leader, please allow us to go. The military strength of our 3 clans is enough to finish the battle in 15 minutes. Clearly, those 2,000 guards thought that they were hiding, but they had been discovered by Ji Tianqing and the others long ago. However, Ji Tianqing couldn't be bothered with them. Hearing the clan leader's request, Ji Tianqing waved his hand and replied, "They are just soldiers who were forced by military orders. Since they retreated voluntarily, there is no need to make things difficult for them. The most important thing now is to enter the secret realm and finish off the overlooking wind zone lord." The clan leaders didn't have any objections. They all acknowledged the order. Next, everyone started to break the array at the entrance of the secret realm. The array was originally on the mountain peak. After the mountain peak was destroyed, the array altar was also destroyed. The great formation was also blasted apart. The invisible formation light wall was exposed and revealed in the sky. It was covered in cracks. Clan leader Wanyan and the others went up. They couldn't be bothered to break the array. The clan leaders joined forces with a dozen divine kings to attack together and break the array with brute force. Chapter 4163. Boom. Crack. With a deafening cracking sound, the array in the sky was broken, and a huge hole appeared. Ji Tianqing stepped through the hole and entered the secret realm of the Windfall Territorial Lord. The god-slaying battleship followed closely behind, and the other 8 forces battleships also entered one after another. The secret realm was spacious, and the scenery was picturesque. However, it was quiet all around, and the air was filled with tension and depression. Half a month ago, the Windfall Territorial Lord had evacuated all unrelated personnel, leaving only 8,000 soldiers to guard the secret realm. At this moment, the secret realm looked peaceful, but danger lurked in every corner. There were arrays and traps everywhere. In the sky, Ji Tianqing stood on the top of the god-slaying battleship with his hands behind his back, looking ahead calmly. The White Dragon steered the god-slaying battleship forward at a steady pace. The 8 divine battleships followed behind, arranged in a sharp knife formation, showing a domineering posture that could penetrate everything. When the fleet had just advanced 10,000 miles, Ji Tianqing frowned. A divine light flashed in his right hand, and he took out the divine hammer. He looked at the empty sky in front of him and waved the divine hammer in his right hand, smashing out 2 beams of dazzling divine light. Swoosh! Swoosh! The 2 beams of divine light carried endless power and smashed into the sky 1,000 miles away, causing 2 earth-shattering explosions. Bang! Bang! In the seemingly empty sky, a canopy actually appeared and was smashed to pieces on the spot. Obviously, it was a trap array set up by the Windfall Territorial Lord. It had been invisible before it was activated. However, this hidden array could not escape Ji Tianqing's eyes. He had seen through it a long time ago. The array was broken, and the fleet was not affected at all. They continued to advance. Next, the fleet had to advance 10,000 miles to reach the Territorial Lord's mansion. During this process, Ji Tianqing would find 7 trap arrays, killing arrays and maze arrays, as well as 6 trap. The Windfall Territorial Lord had spent a lot of effort, time, manpower, and resources to set up those arrays and trap. However, Ji Tianqing could always see through them in advance and break them quickly with simple and violent means. The fleet had been advancing steadily without any obstruction. 100 breaths later, the fleet arrived outside the domain chief's manor. At this time, in the domain chief's manor surrounded by mountains, the domain chief had already received the news through the reports of the various surveillance formations and scouts. When he found out that the formations and traps he had set up with all his might had failed to cause any trouble to the fleet, he was shocked. Therefore, Kenshin was able to easily break through the array formations and trap. His expression immediately turned ugly, and his eyes flashed with deep shock and awe. He couldn't help but sigh, as expected of the Kenshin. I spent nearly a month of effort, but I couldn't even stop him for a moment. Other than the Imperial tutor, who else is qualified to exchange blows with him? The Windfall District Lord's lips curled into a bitter smile. He had already predicted the outcome. But even so, there was no turning back. He could not back down, nor could he back down. After all, he was the #1 loyal subject of the Imperial tutor. The imprint on him was too deep and could not be erased. Even if he wanted to surrender, Kenshin might not accept it. Moreover, his family had been taken away by the Imperial tutor to the Dark Knight domain. If he surrendered now, he was afraid that his family would not have a good ending. Let's go. Let's see the glory of the peerless Kenshin with our own eyes. The Windfall District Lord collected his chaotic thoughts. He stood up and straightened his cloak. Then, he led the generals out of the study. Outside the domain chief's manor, 8,000 elite soldiers were divided into 2 circles to protect the domain chief's manor. The defensive formation within a radius of 10,000 miles was also activated. There were a total of 3 layers, protecting dozens of mountains within it. The soldiers were all equipped with armor and swords. They were ready to attack. Their murderous aura surged as they looked sternly at the 9 warships in the sky outside the formation. The 9 warships were still in the knife-edge formation. The thousands of soldiers had yet to show themselves. Only Ji Tianqing stood at the top of the Godslayer warship and looked at the domain chief's manor indifferently. He could see through the 3 layers of defensive formations at a glance. They were all king-grade divine formations. Their power was interconnected and their power was superimposed. For an ordinary god king, the 3 layers of defensive formations were difficult to deal with. They could not be broken in a short time. However, Ji Tianqing did not take them seriously. With the Godslayer warship and his divine hammer, he could quickly break through them. He waited patiently and did not rush to attack because the uneasiness in his heart had not disappeared. He was very confident that there were only 8,000 soldiers and the Windfall District Lord in the domain chief's manor. However, he still wanted to see if there were any other ambushers besides the 8,000 soldiers. Or perhaps the Imperial tutor had made arrangements and plans to ambush some experts here? If the 2 sides were to fight, and the Azura God Emperor's avatar suddenly appeared, that would be the most surprising and exciting thing for him. Although it sounded ridiculous, he did not rule out this possibility, because he believed in the warning given by the heavens. Soon, the Windfall District Lord, escorted by a dozen divine generals, flew to the sky above the domain chief's manor. They were thousands of miles away from Ji Tianqing. They faced each other across the defensive formation. Greetings, Kenshin. As soon as the 2 sides met, the Windfall District Lord and a dozen divine generals cupped their fists and bowed to Ji Tianqing. Both their tone and posture were respectful. They were sincere and not pretentious. Although the 2 sides were enemies, there was no deep hatred between them. Even if they had to fight with their weapons and fight with their lives, it was only because they were on different sides. This did not stop the Windfall District Lord and the others from showing respect to Kenshin from the bottom of their hearts. Not all enemies were bad people. It was even more impossible for them to be unreasonable and vicious people. Those who could become god kings and domain lords might be sinister and treacherous, or they might be scheming. However, none of them were fools. In fact, everyone in the boundless heaven continent knew whether Kenshin's actions were for his own benefit or for the sake of justice. Ji Tianqing nodded slightly in return and said, "Everyone, you're too courteous. The great battle is imminent. I have a few words to say. Although they may be nonsense, I still have to say them. After all, what I and the Rebel Alliance are doing is not for the sake of killing or power. It is only for freedom and peace. Everyone present, if you can stop now and surrender, you can also avoid the calamity of the weapons and make even more soldiers sacrifice their lives. I promise to spare one of you from death and not pursue the matter." In fact, both sides' attitudes were very clear. These words were just a formality. If there were really soldiers who surrendered, Ji Tianqing would certainly fulfill his promise. However, the result was as everyone expected. None of the generals stepped forward to admit defeat. The Windfall District Lord also cupped his fists and bowed. Kenshin, as the saying goes, a loyal man should serve with his life. Life is small, but reputation is important. Although we are not strong enough to defeat you, we are not afraid to die on the battlefield in the name of loyalty and filial piety. The so-called loyalty was naturally loyal to the imperial tutor and the Azura god emperor. As for filial piety, it was naturally to protect his family. If he died here, he would leave behind the name of a loyal subject. The imperial tutor would also take good care of his family. If he surrendered now, he could live, but he would have to bear a bad reputation and implicate his family. Chapter 4164. Since the Protectorate Lord had made his stance clear, there was nothing more for them to say. Ji Tianqing stopped persuading them to surrender. He raised his hand and gave the order to attack. The 9 divine warships led by the god-slaying battleships were ready to attack. They had activated the array and accumulated powerful energy. The 500 cannons on each warship were aimed at the defensive array of the Protectorate Lord's mansion. When Ji Tianqing gave the order to attack, the 9 divine warships released destructive energy. Boom! 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 More than 3,000 cannons spewed out dazzling divine light. They turned into thousands of dazzling light pillars and blasted at the defensive array. The 50 god kings and 8,000 soldiers under the Region Lord's command were prepared for battle long ago. When the 9 divine warships launched their attack, they joined forces to cast spells and injected endless divine power into the array to strengthen it. At the same time, hundreds of soldiers who specialized in operating the divine array also controlled the array to release thousands of Kenshin light blades toward the 9 divine warship. Bang 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 bang! Boom! Boom! In the next moment, the sky-covering divine power light pillars collided with all kinds of light blades. There was a deafening explosion in the sky and it spread for tens of thousands of miles. Many light beams and light blades collapsed in the collision, splashing fragments all over the sky. The explosive energy wrapped around the divine light fragments and formed a torrent that spread outward and swept everything away. In the blink of an eye, the divine power light blades that filled the sky were shattered. More than half of the 3,000 light pillars released by the 9 divine warships collapsed. The remaining 1,000 light pillars hit the defensive array. Bang bang bang! Another series of loud noises reverberated between heaven and earth. Domain Lord Linfeng had thought that the 8,000 soldiers would be able to counter the 2,000 light pillars. The remaining 1,000 light pillars shouldn't be a threat to the defensive array. But he forgot that more than 300 of the light pillars were released by the god-slaying battleship. Boom! Crack! Therefore, amidst the crisp shattering sounds, hundreds of holes were blasted into the first layer of the defensive formation, and the cracks were densely packed. The defensive light shield was severely damaged. It flashed with divine light and shook violently. Although the light shield didn't shatter or collapse, it had lost its protective power and needed to be repaired. In the midst of the battle, the Headwind Region Lord and the others naturally did not have the opportunity to repair the formation. At this moment, Ji Tianqing waved his divine hammer again and struck out 2 beams of divine light, striking the holes and cracks in the formation. Crack! Along with the sound of an explosion, The first layer of the defensive light shield was shattered and dissipated into pieces. Seeing this, the hearts of the Linfeng district lord and the 8,000 soldiers skipped a beat, and they all looked anxious and worried. His opponent had only used a single round of attacks from the godly warship, yet they had managed to break through a layer of defensive light barrier so easily. It was obvious that the remaining 2 layers of defensive formations would not be able to hold on for much longer. The Overlord of 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 the Overlord. The 9 divine warships gathered their power again and released thousands of light pillars, launching a second powerful attack. Filled with anxiety, the Downwind Protectorate Lord personally controlled the second layer of the formation, raising its defensive power to the maximum. Pung pung pung. This time, the thousands of light pillars struck the defensive formation, causing an earth-shattering boom to erupt. The light barrier was also riddled with cracks. The 8,000 soldiers of the Linfeng district did not fight back. They supported the defensive formation with all their might, but they still couldn't block the attacks of the 9 divine warships. The king-level upper-class divine warships of the 8 forces were not so bad. Although they were powerful, they couldn't break the defensive light shield with one hit. The most powerful and lethal one was still Ji Tianqing's god-slaying warship. After cracks appeared in the defensive formation, Ji Tianqing waved his divine hammer and smashed out 4 beams of dazzling divine light. Kaboom! Another deafening explosion sounded, and the second layer of the defensive formation was also destroyed. The 8,000 soldiers of the Linfeng district panicked. Their hearts were burning with anxiety and worry. The Linfeng district lord also knew that it was useless to fight back, so he personally cast a spell and led the soldiers in a counterattack. Needless to say, the 8,000 soldiers activated their divine power with all their might and performed all kinds of secret techniques and trump cards. Kaboom! The light pillars released by the 9 divine warships collided with the divine light shadows in the sky, creating a deafening sound. This time, the 9 divine warships attacked 3 times in a row before the third layer of the defensive formation was completely destroyed. Without the protection of the 3 layers of formations, the 8,000 soldiers of the district lord's mansion were completely exposed to the fleet. Everyone knew that the moment of life and death had come. The 8,000 soldiers all looked solemn. They launched the final counterattack with solemn and resolute emotions. The Linfeng district lord hurriedly ordered the soldiers to spread out and fight the 9 divine warships. If they stayed together, they would only become living targets for the fleet. This tactic worked. After the 8,000 soldiers spread out, the bombardment of the 9 divine warships did not cause too many casualties. Instead, after the soldiers spread out, they attacked with all their might, which put the 8 divine warships in danger. Therefore, Ji Tianqing also decisively ordered the soldiers to attack. Thousands of disciples of the 8 forces flew out of the divine warship. Under the leadership of the family leaders and elders, they started to fight the soldiers of the Linfeng district. Thus, the true battle began. More than 10,000 divine emperors and nearly 100 divine kings fought fiercely on the battlefield within a radius of 50,000 miles. The sky darkened and the earth dimmed. Almost every moment, soldiers from both sides were killed. Flesh and blood splattered everywhere. They let out painful and dying cries. The area was completely chaotic. Scenes of blood and fire intertwined were everywhere. Ji Tianqing did not stay idle. He led Yunyao, Jiku, and 10 other people into the battlefield. They each looked for a target to kill. Ji Tianqing's target was naturally the Linfeng district lord and the divine generals beside him. Yunyao, Jiku, and the others were mainly responsible for killing the enemy's divine kings and protecting their own troop. This fierce battle lasted for a whole hour before it ended. The aftermath of the battle between the two sides blasted the area within a radius of 50,000 miles into ruins. Towering mountains and steep ridges, dense forests and vegetation, as well as the magnificent Linfeng District Lord's mansion, many palaces and courtyards, all turned into dust. After an hour, the battle finally ended. The loud noise that reverberated between heaven and earth slowly dissipated. The dust and rain of blood that blotted out the sky continued to fall. There was no suspense about the outcome of the battle. The Linfeng District Lord and his 8,000 soldiers had all died on the battlefield. They turned into dust and returned to heaven and earth. They had paid the price with their lives for loyalty and righteousness. Ji Tianxing's troops had also lost close to 1,000 people. But compared to the enemy's complete annihilation, this battle could be said to be a complete victory. After the battle, Ji Tianxing only collected the godhead fragments of the 50 divine kings. He handed over the task of cleaning the battlefield and collecting the spoils of war to his subordinate. 2 hours later, the news that the Linfeng District Lord had been defeated and the rebel alliance had captured the Linfeng District spread. 4 hours later, another army of the rebel alliance had also defeated the Yuantian District Lord and captured the Yuantian District. As a result, only the Anya District had not been captured by the rebel alliance on the entire Boundless Heaven continent. Chapter 4165. The army led by Nangong Buhua was responsible for attacking the Origin Heaven domain. Although that army didn't have Ji Tianxing overseeing it, there were more divine emperors than Nangong Buhua. However, the army was larger in number, and there were more god kings among them. There were only about 10,000 soldiers guarding the Origin Heaven domain. Therefore, it wasn't difficult for the army led by Nangong Buhua to win. A few hours later, the night passed and a new day arrived. The news that the Overlooking Wind domain and the Origin Heaven domain had been captured by the rebel alliance, and that the 2 domain lords and 20,000 soldiers had all died in battle spread across the Boundless Heaven continent. When the billions of people heard the news, they celebrated with joy, feeling proud of the rebel alliance and the Kenshin. Everyone believed that in a few days, the Kenshin would capture the Anya domain and kill the imperial tutor, and the war that had lasted for a year would be over. The dark rule and oppression that had lasted for thousands of years on the Boundless Heaven continent had also come to an end. This was a world-shaking event that changed the era and the Overlord's position. It would definitely be recorded in history and praised by future generations for tens of thousands of years. The billions of people were honored to be able to witness the whole process with their own eyes. At the same time, when the news reached the Anya domain, the billions of people were excited and full of anticipation. Although the people of this domain were the most oppressed by the Azura Divine Palace, they feared and hated the Azura Divine Palace the most. At the beginning of the Rebel Alliance's uprising, they didn't have any hope. But as one domain after another was captured by the Kenshin, more and more people regained their freedom, and they also had hope and expectations. Now, the 99 domains of the entire Boundless Heaven continent had been occupied, and only the Anya domain had not been captured. Of course, the people were excited, expectant, and a little anxious. They even hoped that the 2 armies of the Rebel Alliance wouldn't rest, and that they would rush to the Anya domain and capture it as soon as possible. It would be best if they could capture the Anya domain in a day or 2, save the billions of people, and announce that peace and freedom had been restored to the entire Boundless Heaven continent. On the other side, the 30,000 soldiers under the imperial tutor were all restless and worried when they heard the news. The army's morale, which had just stabilized some time ago, collapsed by more than half in a day. Everyone in the army was discussing this matter. Everyone was in low spirits and their hearts were burning with anxiety. After all, the Dark Night region was already surrounded on all sides. They were alone and without help. Even if they had 30,000 soldiers, they still had the numerical advantage against the 20,000 soldiers of the rebel alliance. However, they had already lost their momentum. Everyone felt that they would definitely lose this battle. Thus, many of the low-level soldiers gathered together to discuss whether or not they should escape. There was still a chance to escape before the two armies of the rebel alliance entered the Dark Knight domain and completed the encirclement. Over 200 Divine King powerhouses and generals naturally took notice of such a great disturbance in the morale of the army. They were also very worried and anxious. They issued strict orders many times to not allow the soldiers to discuss the rebel alliance, but it was useless. On the contrary, the more they suppressed the soldiers, the more they wanted to escape. As a result, the helpless god kings and generals could only ask the 12 divine generals for a countermeasure. In their opinion, the 12 divine generals had met the imperial tutor and had a secret conversation with the imperial tutor. As for why the imperial tutor was so confident and calm, he must have told them the reason. The 200 divine kings and generals hoped that the 12 divine generals would also tell them so that they could be at ease. Not long after, the 200 divine kings and generals expressed their wishes to the 12 divine generals. Unfortunately, the 12 divine generals made it clear that the imperial tutor had strictly ordered them to keep it a secret and not reveal any information. However, they could guarantee that the reason why the imperial tutor was so confident and calm was absolutely reliable. The soldiers did not have to worry about the rebel alliance at all. No matter how powerful the Kenshin was, the Azura Divine Palace would be fine. Victory would belong to them. Just like that, the 200 divine kings and generals were dismissed. Although they were still confused and did not know the specific reason, they felt much more at ease. However, the awkward thing was that when faced with the countless soldiers under their command, they still had no way to explain it. They could only pat their chests and swear that the imperial tutor had already thought of a countermeasure and had made preparations. He was just waiting for the rebel alliance to come and throw away their lives. Everyone did not have to worry or doubt. The Azura Divine Palace would definitely stand tall, and the rebel alliance would be destroyed in the end. These meaningless words had no effect on the soldiers. The soldiers, whose morale was at its lowest and whose hearts were heavy, would not believe these words. In fact, many people believed that the imperial tutor had not done anything in the past few months and was waiting for death to come. Now that the rebel alliance had already killed their way to their doorstep and the imperial tutor had not done anything, he must have been at his wits' end. Since that was the case, there was no need to wait any longer. It was better to run. Thus, on the second night after the rebel alliance conquered the Overwind and Origin Sky regions, more than 3,000 divine lords fled the Dark Knight region. On the third night, several divine kings and more than 1,000 divine lords took the opportunity to escape. On the fourth night, there were still more than 1,000 people who planned to escape. However, the strict inspection of the generals did not give them the chance to escape. Even so, only 25,000 of the 30,000 soldiers of the Dark Knight region remained. Compared to the 20,000 soldiers of the Rebel Alliance, they did not have much of an advantage. On the fifth day, the 1,000 or so soldiers who had failed to escape became restless again. Unfortunately, when the sun set, the Rebel Alliance's army finally arrived. The first to arrive outside the Azura Paradise was the fleet led by the god-slaying warship. The Azura Paradise was the lair of the Azura God Emperor. The famous Azura Divine Palace was inside. The paradise was 1,000,000 miles wide and was like a small world. It had a vast territory and rich resources. Normally, the Azura Divine Palace housed nearly 100,000 people. Most of them were servants and family members. There were only 10,000 guards and dozens of divine kings. However, at this moment, 15,000 of the 25,000 soldiers under the command of the imperial tutor were inside the paradise. The other 10,000 soldiers were guarding outside the paradise. Some of the soldiers were guarding the paradise's entrance. Most of them were patrolling the surroundings and monitoring the movement. A few months ago, traps, ambushes, and all kinds of formations were set up around the Paradise's entrance. Ji Tianxing rode the god-slaying warship and led the army toward the Paradise's entrance. Along the way, he found more than a dozen traps and formations. He either tried to avoid them or destroyed them by force. Since he used his arts to destroy the traps and formations, it would definitely cause a huge commotion. Therefore, the fleet could not hide their tracks. When they were 50,000 miles away from the Azura Paradise's entrance, they were discovered by the patrolling guards.